Sabha, you are the host now.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Taresha, who is there?
Yes, ma'am.
When in the afternoon at 3:45 we have this plenary talk by Professor Velche Narayan Rao garu, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So he was not sure of his technical skills and all, but I think he sent us his PPT.
Okay, ma'am. I'll. Do you want me to share that at that time?
So somebody should be there ready in case he needs any help, any technical help. We'll have to help him. So all of you should be alert.
Sure.
Because
sure,
he's right now in a remote village in Andhra.
Okay.
So yeah. So if there is any problem, he will speak and we can run that PPT. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. That shouldn't be a problem. Okay.
Yeah. 3:45.
Okay.
Taresha, I had sent it to you, right?
We are
Hello.
online. Please avoid talking and slide.
Hello, this is Oma here. Good morning.
Good morning.
So my paper is third, no? According to the program.
Yes,
Hello?
yes. Yes.
Tarkesha live stream has already started. We have still time, right?
Good morning, ma'am. I had a question that is it compulsory to have a PPT while presenting?
No need. You need to keep to the time.
All right, fine. No issues, sir.
I
And
also
my
don't
purpose
have a
is-
PPT.
Please use chat box to converse because it's being streamlined. begin.
May I start, sir? Am I audible?
Yes.
Good morning to you all. A warm welcome to you all on this wonderful Wednesday to the third day of our online international seminar on translation as reconstruction, issues of self, canon, history, and memory in India, organized by the Department of Translation Studies, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, India. I am Gayatri, a PhD scholar from the Department of Translation Studies, EFLU. This is the 7th session featuring the theme Post-Colonial Strand in Translation. I take the privilege of welcoming our chairperson, Associate Professor Dattatreya Mallappa, for this 7th session on Post-Colonial Strand in Translation. Dr. Dattatreya Mallappa is an Associate Professor, Department of Postgraduate Studies and Research in English, Kuvempu University. His areas of specialization include cultural theory, post-colonial studies, popular culture and literature, literary theory, subaltern and marginal writings, Indian literatures in English and translation. He has presented many research papers in both national and international seminars and has published widely in reputed journals. He has organized and attended as a resource person in a number of seminars, conferences, workshops, and symposium. He adorned many academic bodies as a chairperson and as a member. We are happy to have you here, sir. With this brief introduction, I would like to hand over the platform to Dr. Dattatreya to lead the session. Before handing over the session, I politely remind the participants to kindly mute yourself throughout the session and reserve your questions. After all the presentations of this session, we can have a healthy interaction. This is a humble request for the presenters to consider the stipulated time from 15 to 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
So please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, sir. You're on mute, sir. Yeah. Now, yes.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now?
Have you logged in from 2 devices?
Hold on. There's some problem here. I just had something.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, it is a little better.
Okay.
You are audible.
There's a problem because I'm using double devices. So let me unmute one and
You are not audible now.
now.
Don't use the phone.
Okay. We have. Echo.
Keep the phone away. Switch it off, rather.
So we have today Ivy Imogen Hansen, the first presenter today. She would be speaking on Murmur and the role of native informant in Santhal ethnographic studies. I will have around 20 minutes to make your presentation. Later I'll call on Patik Roy and Uma Damodaran and Jay Jeevan. In the meantime, I will try to fix this switch.
Ivy, unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yeah, you're
Is
audible.
it my turn now? Is it my turn? Hello. Shall I begin? Hara?
Yes, please.
Okay,
Yes,
okay, yes.
please.
Yes, sorry, I have some issues with the laptop, so I'm using my mobile phone. And also the notes, the paper that I have is on the laptop, and I thought it is better if I use the mobile. And I hope I'm audible, and also my video can be
You are
seen.
fine. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So my paper is titled. Yes, I would first like to begin by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of a wonderful audience like we have today. So my paper is on Sangram Murmu and the role of the native informant in Santhal ethnographic studies. Ethnography and ethnology have been described by Raymond Williams in keywords as specialized areas within anthropology, which is a discipline for studying primitive societies. While ethnography is defined as descriptive studies of customs, ethnology is called the theories of cultural development. The figure of the native informant, which originated in ethnography, was introduced into post-colonial studies by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak in a book, Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, where she begins. Just a minute, I'm not able to scroll this down. Okay, yes. So she, okay, in a book, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, where she begins by stating her aim of tracking the figure of the native informant through philosophy, literature, history, and culture. This leads her to the conclusion that the native informant has been appropriated by both the colonial and post-colonial subjects. To quote, I found that the tracking showed up a colonial subject detaching itself from the native informant. After 1989, I began to sense that a certain post-colonial subject had in turn been recoding the colonial subject and appropriating the native informant's position. Spivak goes on to say that the native informant is taken with utmost seriousness only in the discipline of ethnography, though even here he or she is denied a voice. To quote, in that discipline, that is ethnography, the native informant, although denied autobiography as it is understood in the Northwestern European tradition, codenamed West, is taken with utmost seriousness. He, and occasionally she, is a blank, though generative of a text of cultural identity that only the West or a Western model discipline could inscribe. More importantly, another important writer who has referred to the native informant is Harish Trivedi in his recent essay, The Kama Sutra in English, 4 versions, published in the edited volume, Violets in a Crucible, Translating the Orient, published in 2019. Spivak's book was published in 1999. And Harish Trivedi's article is in 2019. Here, Harish Trivedi dwells on the shadowy figures of 2 Indian scholars who helped who helped Richard Burton in his clandestine translation of the Kama Sutra from Sanskrit into Gujarati and thereafter into English, namely Bhagwan Lal Indrajit and Shivaram Parshuram Bide, referring to the common practice in colonial translation where Indian experts collaborated with Western semi-experts but were unnamed in the final production. Trivedi writes, they, that is Indian experts, often provided the foundation, if not also part of the structure of translations, which named the Westerners who supervised and revised the translations, but systematically erased the key role played by the Indian collaborator, except sometimes for a passing mention in the prefaces. My paper takes off from these two critical writings on the role of the native informant in colonial times. However, I differ from them in a key aspect. My area of study is based not on the translation of mainstream Indian texts into English, but on the documentation and translation of tribal folk tales in the field of Santhal ethnography. It examines the role of Sagram Murmu, a Santhal school teacher and postman. Sorry, I have to put this down because I am not able to scroll it properly on my laptop. Okay, so yes, it examines the role of Sagram Murmu, a Santhal school teacher and postman who worked closely with the great Norwegian missionary cum ethnographer, Reverend Paul Olaf Bodin, while he was doing research for the voluminous encyclopedic dictionary called a Santhal Dictionary, published in 1929 and between 1929 and 1936, and Boding's Santhal folk tales in 3 parts, which were published between 1925 and 1929. Sagram Murmu worked with P.O. Boding for over 20 years, during which time he helped in documenting many Santhal folk tales, as well as providing meanings for the Santhali words included in the dictionary. On the insistence of Boding, he also wrote down his knowledge of Santhal traditions and customs and other specialized tribal knowledge. While his name was not mentioned in the preface of Boding's works, it did appear along with the stories collected by him, and sometimes he was also mentioned in the footnotes. A few other mentions of him are found in Boding's personal writings in the Norwegian language, such as his diaries and letters. Hence, the contribution of Sagram Murmu and other collaborators are almost forgotten. In recent times, the first important reference to Sagram Murmu appears in a compilation of the Santhali manuscripts that were collected and partially translated into English by Boding. After Boding's death, the entire collection was kept in the Oslo University Library and then moved to the National Library of Oslo, which I have also visited, by the way, where they were digitalized and made available to research scholars. The book was written, and the book, that is the compilation, was written and published under a project of the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, or NIAS, and was titled Santhalia, Catalogue of Santhal Manuscripts in Oslo. Interestingly, the compiler was Santosh K. Soren, an educated Santhal who was then working as a librarian in Copenhagen, Denmark, and who might also be considered as a native informant based in the metropolis of Europe. In this book, Santosh Soren clearly writes about the contribution of the various native informants working with Boding. To quote, "It is quite well known that the majority of the manuscripts were written by Sagram Murmu of Moholpahari. But there were also others who contributed much to the corpus of the manuscript materials. Signatures were, however, not always provided by the writers in each and every story. This situation makes it difficult to pinpoint accurately who wrote which story. Therefore, the names of the writers were entered only under those titles which were found to have their signatures, given generally at the end of the stories. So this was noted down by Santosh Soren, who was at one of a librarian, Santhal, who was as a librarian, working as a librarian in Denmark, and he was working on this project in Oslo. Soren's book appeared in 1999, the same year as Gayatri Spivak's aforementioned book, but it was not sold in India and remained little known to the scholars here. Much later, mentions of Sangram Murmu also appeared in a book titled An Encounter of Peripheries, Santals, Missionaries and Their Changing Worlds, 1867 to 1900, written by two French social anthropologists, Marine Carin and Herald Tams Leach. Here, in the chapter, Tradition and its Reinvention, they began by mentioning the names of all the native informants who collaborated with P.O. Boarding in his linguistic and cultural work. These included men such as Kudu, Biram, Sagram, Mongol, Sido, and two women named Sona and Anpi. Among them, Sagram was perhaps the one on whom Boarding relied the most. It is for this reason that Carin and Tams Leach even went to the extent of saying that Sagram Murmu was, within quotes, the main author of the 3 volumes of Santhal folk tales published by Boarding. In another book titled From Fire Rain to Rebellion, Reasserting Ethnic Identity Through Narrative, edited by Peter B. Anderson, Marine Carin, and Santosh K. Soren, more detailed references to Sagram Murmu were made in the lengthy introduction. Under the subheading Sagram Murmu, collector or author, the editors commented on his ambiguous situation. I quote, Murmu was not a collector who passively reported the common property of the Santals, as Boarding also saw him, but an author who formed his stories in accordance with his own opinions. Nevertheless, he was also a trustworthy reporter. In many cases, we can see where he stuck to the wording of his informants, as in the handling of a questionnaire of 50 questions on the clan system, which he used for a survey he conducted for Boarding, presumably in 1907. Here, Boarding diligently commented on the informant, his or her willingness to talk, their clan, and the legends of that clan. His tendency to add moral comments to the folk tales he collected and documented is also mentioned in the same book by Anderson, Carin, and Soren. Here, hence, Sagram Murmu was clearly not a passive informant. This brings us to the 3 main questions raised in this paper. What was the relationship between the external researcher or ethnographer, the native informant, and the translator? Second, what share of the credit for producing these scholarly works belonged to the native informant? And third, did Sagram Murmu, as a native informant, provide any counter narrative to the dominant discourse on tribes? By way of finding answers to these highly complex questions, let me compare and contrast Sagram Murmu with the native informants working with Richard Burton, whom I had mentioned earlier. Harish Trivedi has pointed out in the paper that I've already mentioned about by him. Harish Trivedi has pointed out that both Bhagwan Lal Indraji and Shivaram Parshuram Bhide, these were considered to be the real translators of the Kama Sutra, the first Kama Sutra. Okay, so both Indraji and Bhide were highly educated scholars. He even rejects the term native informant as being derogatory and not applicable to such scholars, listing the many honors bestowed on Indraji by his colonial masters. Trivedi writes, if any one person can be called the first translator of the Kama Sutra from Sanskrit into a modern language, which provided the basis for its first translation indirectly into English, it was thus Bhagwan Lal Indraji. And he was not an quote-unquote informant, but a scholar of the first rank. Here, a clear distinction is made between the illiterate or semi-educated native informant of ethnography who belonged to a marginal community and the expert translator who was from the mainstream Indian society. The writings of Marion Karin and others in recent times have been attempts to remove Sagram Murmu's liminal identity as a native informant and reclaim him as one of the real authors of the Santhal folk tales. However, due to his lack of knowledge of English, the target language of the translations, Sagram cannot be considered among the primary translators. Bording was and will remain the primary translator of the Santhal folk tales. Sagram Murmu's role is finally difficult to pin down because he was not a passive informant or collector. He was actively involved in the interpretative process and intervened several times to explain the meaning of certain symbols and incidents found in these folk tales. Finally, he may even have provided a counter narrative to the dominant discourse on tribes held by missionaries and other mainstream groups. But before that part of his contribution can be fully understood, more research into his collaborative work with P.O. Bording needs to be done. And with this, I would like to end my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivy. I think we'll call the next person now. Should we have a discussion right now, or should we keep the whole thing in the end?
No, sir, we can have it.
Right now?
No, sir. After all the presentations.
Okay. The next presenter is Patik Roy. He would be speaking on revisiting the Neel Darpan controversy, appropriating colonial surveillance for national resistance and evangelizing zeal. Neel Roy, please.
Good morning to all, and am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Yes, you are audible.
Fine. With the permission of the chair, I'd like to start my paper. And as the chair rightly pointed out, I will be talking about, I'll revisit the Neel Darpan controversy, and I will try to problematize the whole controversy with respect to colonial surveillance, nationalist resistance, and evangelizing zeal. So my paper engages with the play written in the early days of Bengali drama by Dinabandhu Mitra. So in Bengali, the title was Neel Darpan, which roughly translates into the indigo planting mirror. And the year of publication was 1860, which we all know is just about 3 years after 1857, which for many of us would be the first war of independence. Hence, it is profitable to be alive to the facts that the events of 1857 inscribe in complex ways all that transcribed after the publication and the subsequent translation of Neel Darpan, culminating in the Censorship Act of 1876, which empowered local government authorities to prohibit dramatic performances. Now, allow me to contextualize the controversy at first by filling in the basic historical details before I move into a critical engagement with it along 3 registers. See, the immediate socio-political context of the play was the Neel Bidroh, or the Indigo Rebellion of 1859. The practices of the planters to enforce the plantation of indigo by the ryots or the farmers was not just exploitative, it was downright inhuman, involving corporal punishments, tortures, abductions, murders, even rapes as instruments of coercion. Consequently, all this crystallized into the uprising of the farmers in the indigo growing belt of Bengal in February 1859. Now, Neel Darpan, which incidentally is Dinabandhu Mitra's first play, moves away from the Sanskrit tradition of drama, which had hitherto held sway, and moves into the registers of social realism vis-a-vis this event of the colonial interface in Bengal. So it graphically depicts plights of an old landholder and his family and the peasants of Lower Bengal through series of physical torture, rape, madness, death. So the play was anonymously published from Dhaka in 1860, and it became a great stage success. And in many ways, Neel Darpan facilitated the subsequent rise of drama, which had a very, very strong proto-nationalist coloring. Now, Dinabandhu Mitra must have sent a copy of this play to James Long, who was an Irish missionary working with the Bengal peasantry at that time. So his natural sympathies lay with the farmers, for he was alive to the unjust and inhuman practices of the indigo farmers. Further, since the planters were white, British, and Christian, such coercive practices went against the grain of the evangelizing mission of missionaries like Long. Through extension, such coercive practices automatically got associated with European Christianity, leading to a setback of the quasi-imperial project of evangelizing. Hence, given his natural sympathies, combined with his evangelizing gene, the potential of such a book in exposing the heinous practices of the indigo farmers was not lost on Long. So he brought it to the notice of W.S. Seton Carr, who was the secretary of the governor of Bengal. Seton Carr, in turn, brought it to the notice of Lieutenant Governor Grant, who expressed a desire to see a translation of it and authorized the printing of a few copies of the translation for private circulation. Now, the translation was most certainly carried out under the supervision of Reverend Long, who added an introduction to it, and 500 copies of it were printed in 1861 at the cost of 300 rupees. However, Long did one more thing which led to the subsequent controversy. He circulated copies of the translation in the official frank and seal of the Bengal government. The envelopes had the heading, and I quote, "On Her Majesty's service." The circulation of the play generated extreme hostility amongst the indigo planters, who brought a lawsuit against Reverend Long on two charges. One, the introduction of the play penned by Long slandered the editors of two pro-planter newspapers, the Englishman and the Harkaru, and therefore this was a case of defamation and libel. Two, Long had intentionally and maliciously libeled against a class of people designated as the indigo planters of Lower Bengal, and had in effect brought a bad name to the planters. Now, in July 1861, the British India government tried and sentenced Reverend Long to a 1-month imprisonment and fined him 1,000 rupees for the circulation of the translation. So now the question is, did Neel Darpan have so much of subversive potential to warrant such a forceful response on the part of the colonial administration? Now, this brings me to the first of my engagements with the text, to show how Neel Darpan got appropriated for the purposes of nationalist resistance and the growth of a nationalist consciousness in the early stages of colonial rule in Bengal, where a good, evil, moral, immoral binary is attributed to colonial rulers in terms that are quintessentially Indian. This binary tames the subversive energies of the play. On one hand, we have the brutal indigo planters and their avaricious supporters in the form of these newspapers. And on the other, we have these just English rulers who will set everything right. Using a strikingly maternal trope, right, the author tells us in his introduction, and I quote, "The most kind-hearted Queen Victoria, the mother of the people, thinking it unadvisably to suckle her children through maid servants, has now taken them on her own lap to nourish them." Now, it is interesting to note that even this positive maternal image is undercut by the memory of 1857, which led to the Queen's proclamation and to which this particular sentence refers to. The author goes on to praise the most learned, intelligent, brave, and open-hearted Lord Canning, who is the Governor General of India, and also Mr. Grant, who punishes the wicked and supports the good, and who is now the Lieutenant Governor. All right, so he also mentions certain civil servants who are known for their strict impartiality and their great experience. Now, all of this is worked out under an overarching metaphorical trope that lies in elevating the local cultural markers into universal moral properties. The sandalwood which the indigo planters are enjoined upon to apply to erase the stain of selfishness from their forehead stands for benevolence. The great and just Englishmen who constitute the expanding lotuses on the lake of the civil service will wield the Sudarshan Chakra against the great giant, that is the Rahu, who is the indigo plant. Now, as Jharna Shanal points out in her essay, Vernacular Dressings and the English Redressings, and I quote Sanyal, the European milieu, by such metaphorical use, is transposed to a Hindu field of science. The ideas of good and evil are translated through the metaphors of lotus and worm. The good sahibs are the lotus in the lake of civil service, and the indigo planters are worms eating into the fame of the British. Close quotes. Now, here it is appropriate to say that the play may be regarded as an expose of the brutalities of the indigo planters, while at the same time being fiercely loyal to the colonial system of administration and the British sense of justice and fair play. Okay, this is something that Ranojit Guha reiterates in his essay, where he talks about this immense reverence of the Raj that is displayed by Dinabandhu Mitra. Yet, Neel Darpan had long-lasting implications in the growth of nationalist drama in India. And indeed, the visibility of the Neel Darpan in the public imaginary, due to the controversy and the subsequent trial, had the effect of establishing Neel Darpan as the first nationalist drama. Okay, and therefore, as Nandi Bhatia would say in her book, The Acts of Authority, Acts of Resistance, she says that Neel Darpan inaugurated the theatre as a powerful weapon of resistance in the struggle for independence from colonial rule. Now, the point I'm trying to establish is that it is not the original Bengali text as such, but the English translation, along with the attendant publicity that augmented the stature of the text as a nationalist drama, and also inspired in bringing forth a plethora of texts having overt nationalistic tendencies. And these include plays like Surendra Binodini, right, Chakar Darpan. Now, running through all these plays was a nationalist impulse, and the colonial powers took cognizance of the subversive potential of these plays by enacting, as I just said, the Censorship Act of 1876. Now, indeed, the history of Neel Darpan controversy brings out the Foucauldian idea of how power begets its own resistance. The effort at erasing it from public discourse only had the opposite effect. The very act of suppressing the text led to its renewal and perpetuation, and amplified its stature as an inspirational work to be emulated. Now, I come to the second part of my paper, where I seek to explore translation as an act of cultural/political surveillance as a part of a larger colonial paradigm of knowledge creation. In a post-Michel Foucault, post-Edward Said academy, the idea of an innocent, quote-unquote, disinterested knowledge production is debunked. Now, Said's Orientalism is a devastating critique of how the West constructs the Orient, through the production of knowledge within a framework of conscious and determined effort at domination. So I'll shorten my paper here a bit, because after all, we're talking about Said, and I'm sure all of us are more or less familiar with the idea of production of knowledge, which is not disinterested, but is instrumental in furthering a hegemonic agenda. Now, I would like to place Reverend Long's act of translating Neel Darpan in this larger colonial rubric of producing knowledge regarding the natives. As Said says, this is not a disinterested act, but it is also not an act propelled by altruism, given his missionary background, but it was an act deeply inflected by the colonial agenda. See, the first thing is the translation was undertaken at the behest of Lieutenant Governor Grant and the Governor General of Bengal, Setankar. Now, both were very high officials in the colonial hierarchy. So their interest in the translation of Nil Darpan may be construed as a classic instance of translation as a political/cultural surveillance. Now, Reverend Long is well aware of this dimension of this issue. In his address to the court before the sentence is passed, he makes a number of points that show how implicated he is in the overarching structure of colonial knowledge creation. So at the outset, he says that the English translation was not, and I quote him, got up at the suggestion of the natives or even with their knowledge and was not circulated amongst them. So this effectively discounts Indian participation and maps it solely on the colonial enterprise. Secondly, he goes on to say that if at all the, and I quote, work was so injurious in its vernacular dress, was I not doing a public service by making such a work known in English? So thirdly, he makes an appeal to the British court by making a show of his native informant status by virtue of his knowledge of the Indian languages and culture. And I quote what he has to say regarding this. This is directly from his address to the court. He says, I sent to Oxford on request copies of all Bengali translations from Sanskrit, or when I have procured for missionaries, governments, vernacular books of all kinds. Why? At the request of missionaries, I have procured anti-Christian works for them, as they wish to know what was written against Christianity. Unquote. Hence, by his own admission, Reverend Long had been bringing to the notice of the colonial administration hundreds of books in the vernacular and procuring for them all the available English translations. He goes on to say, the Royat is a dumb animal who did not know the ruler's language. Finally, he clinches his argument for translating Nil Darpan by referring to the events of 1857. He says it is unsafe for the English to reside in India in ignorance and indifference to the current of native feeling. Hence, his act of translation is in effect translated into an act of surveillance. Indeed, 1857 is the ever-present Derridian trace in this entire discourse that surrounds the Nil Darpan controversy. Mark what Reverend Long says, and I quote, had I, as a missionary, previous to the mutiny, been able to submit to men of influence a native drama, which would have thrown light on the views of sepoys and native chiefs, how valuable might the circulation of such a drama have proved? My lord, the mutiny has passed away. Who knows what is in the future? So, from his specific location, he is in effect pleading for greater surveillance through access to the vernacular literature under the innocuous garb of translation. And now I come to the last part of my presentation. Apart from his location as an agent of colonial knowledge creation, as a facilitator of vernacular translation, there is yet another location of his that needs to be problematized. Reverend Long is a missionary. And mark it, he's not a British missionary. He's an Irish missionary. And this complicates his affiliations in more nuanced ways. While he subscribes to the overarching structure of European British colonialism, he also has a deep investment in the evangelizing mission of the church. The controversies surrounding the translation of Nil Darpan emerged from the specific historical developments that played out amongst these three parties: the British India government, 1, 2, the indigo planters, 3, and the pro-planter newspapers, and 3, the Christian missionaries. The brutal interface between the Royats, that is the farmers, and the indigo planters jeopardized the missionary agenda of evangelization. In his address to the court, he says, and I quote, of all the obstacles to the spread of Christianity in India, one of the greatest is the irreligious conduct of many of my own countrymen. Thousands of natives have said to me, we judge, they say. So the indigo planter is most definitely falls within this category of his countrymen who impede the spread of Christianity through their actions. Okay. So indeed, in 1860, Reverend Long testified before the Indigo Commission the evidence of the heinous offenses of the indigo planters and cited specific instances of their brutalities. Long was fluent in Bengali, and he presented translations of articles from the weekly Som Prakas that blamed planters for widespread disaffection amongst the Bengali public and the riots, and produced songs and plays that portrayed the farmers' exploitation. Hence, the act of translating Neel Darpan is concurrently located in a desire to bring the tenets of Christianity to the rights of Bengal, while endorsing the overarching colonial narrative. It seeks to undercut those aspects of colonialism that are inimical to the evangelizing agenda. So in this paper, I have problematized the translation of Neel Darpan along three registers. One, translation as an act that built up a proto-nationalist energy before institutionalized nationalism came to be crystallized in the public domain. Two, translation as an act of political cultural surveillance and colonial knowledge creation. Three, translation as an act that sought to further the evangelizing mission of early missionaries in Bengal. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It is indeed very interesting. Now I call upon the next presenter, Uma Damodar Sridhar. Uma Damodar, the topic is Recovering Agency from Colonial Writer, the case of Maridas Pillai. Uma, please.
Good morning. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you're audible.
Good morning, everybody. So first of all, I would like to thank the Department of Translation Studies for giving me this opportunity to present my article in the seminar that has been so rich in terms of ideas and research. So my article is based on the study of the agency of the indigenous translator in 18th century colonial India, based on the case of the Tamil Dubash Maridas Pillai. So I will examine the circumstances and consequences of the publication of his French translation of the Bhagavata Purana in 1772 in France, and his own actions before and thereafter, involving questions of power, authorship, and agency. So as has already been said by the previous writers, it has now been accepted, previous presenters, sorry. In the 18th century, translation and travel writing both acted as instruments of European colonialism and imperialism. But right from the 16th century onwards, texts from India were being translated into dominant European languages for their consumption. They highlighted the alterity and emphasized the strangeness of the text, juxtaposing the differences between a forward-thinking, enlightened Europe and a backward-looking East trapped in an ancient past. Drawing on Foucault's theory on the links between power relations and the construction of the colonial subject, Tejaswini Niranjana had observed that translation as a practice shapes and takes shape within the asymmetrical relations of power that operate under colonialism, thereby highlighting the links between translation, representation, power, and historicity. Further, Edward Said's Orientalism has also highlighted the construction of the Orient by colonial hegemonic powers as an exotic romanticized space, exaggerating the differences between European and Eastern cultures. So I state these facts to simply provide a background to the study at hand. So agency, according to the dictionary, is the ability to take action or choose what action to take. I draw upon Robert Inden's definition of the word in his book, Imagining India, as the capacity of the people to order their world. Inden has critiqued the Indological branch of Orientalist discourse and the accounts of India that it produced since the Enlightenment. He explains that the process of the production of knowledge of others that Europeans and Americans have created during their periods of world ascendancy was essentialist, flowing from determinist scientific approaches. However, the agents, far from embodying simple, unchanging essences, were relatively complex and shifting, making and remaking one another through a dialectic process in changing situations. They acted purposefully and reflectively in more or less complex interrelationships to one another to reiterate and remake the world they lived in. In the colonial context, agency takes on a new meaning. As Inden says, colonialism consisted quite precisely of the attempt to make previously autonomous agents into instruments through which the colonizers could fulfill their desires, and into patience, those who had to be variously pacified or punished, saved, reformed, or developed. The 18th century Enlightenment movement in France is known to be marked by an opening up of Europe to the outside world, both physically and intellectually, that resulted in an inward lookingness, an introspection, and a re-examination of accepted knowledge and beliefs. Although it is later viewed under a critical lens as to its status towards creating a more rational and better world, which is now questioned, it undoubtedly created new spaces of interrogation with respect to geography, natural sciences, and religion. There was a push against the authoritarianism and the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, led by thinkers such as Voltaire in France, strengthened by the discoveries of new, in quotes, new religions in Asia.
You got muted, Uma. Please unmute.
Yeah, I was
We
muted.
lost you. We lost you for a while.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I was muted by the host apparently. Yeah, thank you for, yeah. So there was a push against the authoritarianism and orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, led by thinkers such as Voltaire in France, strengthened by discoveries of new religions, as I said, in Asia, namely Hinduism and Buddhism, indicating alternate philosophies and civilizations that were older than Christianity, challenging the existing paradigms on history, religion, and memory. This resulted in a profusion of writings, enhancing knowledge production about the new countries and cultures encountered by the European travelers, leading to the creation of new discursive formations about foreign cultures. This knowledge was a powerful factor in shaping new thoughts in Europe. However, as Indian argues, these Euro-American selves and Indian others have not simply interacted as entities that remained fundamentally the same. They have dialectically constituted one another. Once one realizes the truth of this, he or she will begin to see that India has played a part in the making of 19th and 20th century Europe, much greater than we of scholarship, journalism, and officialdom would normally wish to allow. From the 16th century onwards, Portuguese, English, Dutch, and the French began to arrive in India, seeking trade opportunities. They had been preceded by Jesuit missionaries who had been coming to India well before. They learned Indian languages to communicate with the locals in the mission to understand the population and spread their religion, and started the work of translation of religious texts. Scores of texts were translated and sent back to Europe in this period, where they were read and analyzed. Many dictionaries and books of Tamil-French vocabulary were also published by the Jesuits in the 18th century, as were Sanskrit grammars. Several among them wrote letters back to their country, which were published first in French, then in other European languages, known as the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, a series of letters on, about India. In this respect, the French, Portuguese, Germans, and Danes had already taken the lead in the study of local languages with respect to the British, who remained largely ignorant of Indian languages. The 18th century also brought a host of travelers who visited India in different capacities: administrators, scholars, naturalists, scientists, and astronomers. They produced books that were published under their names, but some were later revealed to have been the result of collaboration with native scholars who were often unacknowledged. Archival records of the British East India Company reveal several names for the Indian intermediaries who were employed by the company or associated with it, and on whom the British depended for information and knowledge. The anglicized titles of some of these functionaries included Akun, Banyan, Dalal, Dubashi, or Tupasi in Tamil, Gomasti, Pandit, Shroff, and Vakil, as reported by Bernard Cohn, Colonial Forms of Knowledge. These titles varied according to the location of the company factories, but all these Indians had specialized form of knowledge. The Dubash of the Bengal and the Coromandel coast had his function embodied in his title, meaning two languages, do bhasha. Hatcher terms them as local intellectuals who were drawn into various colonial projects associated with the flow of knowledge and power between Europe and South Asia. Dubashi culture is associated in particular with the work of colonial commerce and the practices of European agency houses. However, they also contributed to the translation of Indian textual traditions. The French settled in Pondicherry in the 17th century, in 1764, as the French East India Company, the Compagnie des Indes, and they were administrators of the colony. They were traders, actually, who were also administrators of the colony, and with a triple mission: to colonize, profit, and extend the cause of Christianity. To achieve this, they also employed local debashers who acted as translators, interpreters, and commercial brokers in a fixed hierarchy. At the highest position was the chief commercial broker to the French company in Pondicherry, known as courtier et chef de Malabar. In Pondicherry, this powerful position of courtier and chef de Malabar moved between two families in almost a hereditary manner for almost a century, the Mudalai and the Pillai families, titles that were associated with the Velala caste groups, high-ranking agricultural landlords. Though these two families belonged to the same caste, Pillais were Hindu and Mudalis were Christian. And some of these men played crucial unlauded roles in transforming learning and literature in colonial South India. I now come to the specifics of my topic. In the 18th century, a controversy erupted in the learned circles of France when the naturalist Fouché d'Hobsonville published an anonymous pamphlet in 1785, accusing the French traveler Pierre Sonnerat of helping himself to a Tamil translation of the Bhagavata Purana that had been made by an Indian interpreter in quotes. Sonnerat had just published his voyages to India and China, and he had used parts of this translation in his own book, along with extracts from other religious texts, stating that they had been carried out by a learned Brahmin. However, 3 years later, Fouché d'Hobsonville himself published a Bhagavatam, again anonymously, though he was identified later. In the preface, which he termed Discours Préliminaire, he accused the Indian who had supplied him with an abridged translation of the Bhagavata Purana, or the Bhagavatam, which was based on a Tamil manuscript, of having clandestinely sent a copy of his text to the Minister and Secretary of State in Paris, Jean-Baptiste Bertin, in 1770. Bertin was known for his enlightened taste for sciences and ultimately donated the book to the Bibliothèque du Roi, the Royal Library. In addition, Fouché also blamed this Indian of having sold a copy of the same translation, as well as a few other documents purchased at his expense, to an author of a modern voyage in 2 volumes, pointing to Pierre Sonnerat's work. This Indian was Maridas Poulet, or Poulet in French, or Pillet, a Dubash employed as interpreter to the Conseil Supérieur de Pondicherry. Maridas Pillet's father, Appavu Pillai of the Velala caste, had also been chief interpreter in the Conseil Supérieur de Pondicherry, but he had converted to Christianity, and Maridas was therefore tutored by the missionaries, learning French and Latin, as well as some English and Portuguese. His fluency in this language, knowledge of Hinduism, and closeness to the missionaries soon made him an invaluable intermediary for the academically inclined knowledge seekers who arrived from Europe to India looking for the Vedas, the most sought after religious texts during the 18th century. Indeed, there is less information about his administrative duties as a Dubash and more about his work as a translator. He was well known during that period as an esteemed and indispensable assistant and helped various well-known Indologists such as Anquetil Duperron, who had traveled to Madras to Pondicherry in 1755 to learn Tamil from Maridas, and also the Royal French astronomer Guillaume Le Gentil de la Galassière, who had traveled to Pondicherry in 1760 to study the transit of Venus. Maridas continued to refine his translation of the Bhagavatam even after sending it to Fouché d'Hobsonville. The father H. Hoston, who ultimately published the final work in 1921 in the Revue Historique de Langue Française, stated that Maridas had continued his efforts between 1793 to 95 as he was dissatisfied with his previous translation made for Fouché d'Hobsonville that had no glosses or explanatory notes. Father Hoston credited Maridas as possessing a rare kind of knowledge for that period about religious and philosophical literature, combining the qualities of a philosopher, theologian, historian, and geographer. Maridas Pillai was therefore the author of 2 translations of the Bhagavatam. He was also the author of Memoirs sur l'astronomie indienne, a book on Indian astronomy, undertaken for Charles Auge Monneron, but which remained unpublished. He also had a series of other works that he wished to undertake in future, but he died on 3rd April 1796 in Pondicherry at the age of 75, after completing his last translation of the Bhagavatam. Of course, his translation is not a complete translation of the complete work. As I said, it was based on a Tamil manuscript. And in the 2004 edition of his translation, which I consulted, it is a mere 170 pages in prose form, whereas the original Purana comprises of 10 books, in poetic form, dealing with the creation of the world, cosmogony, genealogy of the gods and kings, mythology, and legends. Maridas was a kind of a resume of the book. But why is it important to acknowledge Marida's translation today? There are three reasons. Firstly, it was the first translation of a Purana to reach Europe. For a continent eagerly awaiting new ways of looking at the world, it announced the presence of other cultures and religions that were more ancient than the European ones, contributing towards the intellectual development of the West. In spite of his ill will towards the Dubash, Fouché's edition exposed the text to the world, and it was read by other Indologists like Joseph de Guigne, possibly even Voltaire, leading to historical consequences. Secondly, it raises the nature of the relationship between the colonial masters who commissioned translations and the fate of the actual translator. To his credit, Fouché d'Hobsonville had complained about the lack of financial support to French scholars working in India, as opposed to the British, who were supported and encouraged by their mother countries. Anquetil Duperron records that Fouché d'Hobsonville paid 25 rupees every month to Maridas for his services and continued this arrangement for some years after his departure from India. However, on October 5, 1772, the Jesuit priest, Father Courdoux, wrote to Anquetil Duperron from Pondicherry, stating that Maridas had complained to him about the considerable expenses incurred by him and for which he did not receive the smallest word of thanks. As a result, he was forced to abandon the translation of a few more arduous manuscripts. Evidently, pecuniary issues continued to plague Maridas, who had capitalized on his talent by producing multiple copies of his translation and selling them to other European customers. Fouché d'Hobsonville's complaints and indignation at what he believed was Maridas' perfidy, therefore must be viewed in the light of the asymmetric power relations that existed between the prosperous patrons of translations commissioned from Indian informants, who were expected thereafter to exhibit complete loyalty and subservience to the colonial patrons on the basis of some monetary returns. The Europeans, on the other hand, did not always show the inclination to acknowledge or promote their Indian informants. Maridas must have realized the significance of the text he was translating and wished it to reach a larger audience, therefore sending a copy to the minister. He was not entirely mistaken, as Fouché d'Hobsonville published the translation anonymously. There is a third reason why Pillai must be remembered. Fouché d'Hobsonville's edition of his translation was read by the Indologist Joseph de Guigne. De Guigne studied the dynastic list of Magadha kings that appeared in the book and observed that the name of a king that Maridas Pillai had transcribed as Chandragupten was in fact probably the Indian king Chandragupta Maurya, referred to as Chandrakotos by the Greeks, a contemporary of the king Alexander. As the date of the latter's conquest was well established, it was possible to synchronize the dates of Indian kings according to Western history, establishing a universal historiography. De Guigne had reported this discovery right in 1772 in his Réflexions sur un livre intitulé Bhagavatam. However, the credit for the discovery went to the British Indologist and scholar William Jones, who reported the same synchrony 20 years after De Guigne. Jones had referred to it in a speech he delivered in 1793 and published in 1799 in the Asiatic Research. Several scholars have subsequently reported De Guigne's discovery in Maridas Pillai's translation, in Fouché's edition, but none of them were given credit. As put succinctly by Troutman, the Asiatic Society gave institutional form and definition to a group of scholar administrators who were fashioning a new claim for authority over the older Orientalism, a claim that largely succeeded. The vogue for the new Orientalism virtually eclipsed earlier writings on India. As we can see then, these texts sourced from indigenous informants attest to the hybridity of texts produced by the European travelers. This opens a view of the sources of pre-colonial European literature on India and the role played by Indian intermediaries in supplying the original materials. Early European travelers relied heavily on educated upper caste Indian Pandits to access Indian texts that they appropriated and published under their own name with their own comments. Michel Cronin writes that the use of local language is a striking feature of British imperial policy in its ability to co-opt local dominated knowledge in a strategy for retaining power. The Dubash had played a crucial, albeit silent role from the beginning of relations between Europe and India, and such was the case of Maridas Pillai, who sold or forwarded his copies to more than one person, thereby laying hollow each of their claims to originality and exercising his own right to claim authorship over his work. As Jyoti Mohan states, even if Indians were in an inferior position, they were the primary informants who contributed to the discourse of Indology. In this way, she says, the native had the opportunity to exercise his agency in the relaying of information about their culture and past to their colonial masters. A reading of this story through the lens of translation and history reveals that it was the Indian Dubash Maridas Pillai who had the last word in the confrontation between him, Dobsonville, and Sonera, recovering his agency as translator and mediator of cultures. Venuti has spoken about the invisibility of the translator, according to the choices made in the course of the process of translation. One can very well speak of the invisibility of the Dubash as the effacing of their identity, raising interrogations about the oral and textual transmission of data across cultures and narrative systems, as quoted from Harrigan. There may be more such stories waiting to be unearthed, and it is time to give back voice and agency to the 18th century translator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uma Sridhar, for a wonderful presentation. Next, we have.
Was I not audible? Now I am seeing.
Yeah, you were clear. I think, I think you were very clear actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I also saw that message, but probably the problem was on the other end.
Yeah.
You were audible. You were audible. You were very clear.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next presenter is Jay Jeevani. He will be speaking on translating Shakespeare, a way of standardizing Gujarati language and literature. Jay Jeevani, please.
Yeah. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible. Yes, you're audible.
All right, I'm sharing my screen. I'm sharing my presentation. Just
Sure.
give me a minute. Is it visible, sir?
Yes, now it's visible.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Fine. So the paper, yeah. So thanks for the opportunity to the department. The thing that I'm going to talk about is translating Shakespeare, a way to standardizing Gujarati language and literature. So what I will be doing in this paper, so the paper attempts to raise the questions related to role of translations in standardization of language and literature. While reading the prefaces of Gujarati textual translations of Shakespeare, translated during late 19th and early 20th century, one come across such specific questions with critics and translators claim about proper and close translation. One of the examples that we can see is Market Thakur. He's a critic in very famous critic in Gujarati literature, and he writes a preface to Hansa Mehta's translation, and he writes a preface to Hansa Mehta's translation of Hamlet, in which he claims that it is the very first close and a proper translation of Shakespearean play, because she has used Gujarati meter, making it words translation being close to blank words play of Shakespeare. It is not. We have to note here that the critic completely ignores the mid-18th century performances of Parsi theatre, as well as a series of early prose translation that was done by N.P. Dave before her. So based on this kind of arguments, this paper will reflect on specific questions which seems to have played a vital role in standardization of Gujarati language and literature. These questions include what makes critic to claim a proper or close translation? Why do these critics or translators ignore Parsi translations performed in Hindustani or Farsi Gujarati while writing the prefaces to these textual translations? Whether we can translate in prose or words and which meter should be used. Or they also debate about the paper claims. This paper claims that these translators have biased and hegemonic view of Gujarati language belonging only to Indo-Aryan family, as the prefaces to this translation completely ignores the use of other dialects such as Hindustani Gujarati, in which these Parsi translations were, performed. So the above questions played a vital role in standardization of Gujarati language and literature. So the very first part of my paper deals with standardization of literature by ignoring the minority translations. When we talk about that, Parsis are considered as minorities, and they played a vital role during mid-18th century to do the performances of Shakespeare. C.C. Mehta, in his paper Shakespeare and Gujarati Stage, has discussed how Shakespearean plays were translated or adapted in wholesale, and later on how characters, scenes, and soliloquies of these translators were used in later original Gujarati plays performed by these theatre groups. There is also one of the critics, Catherine Hansen, in her essay, Language on Stage, Pluralism and Community Formation in the 19th Century Parsi Theatre, she discusses the role of English language and literature to constitute modern Gujarati literature and history of translations from English literature into Gujarati. So Gujarat shares a unique relationship with Shakespeare starting as early as 1852. Parsi Theatre Group performed an adaptation of Shakespeare's Taming of Shrew, titled as Natrangi's Firangi Thekani Aavi in Gujarati at Andrews Library in Surat in 1852. This was the first ever adaptation of Shakespearean play in Gujarati. In his seminal paper, Shakespeare and Gujarati Stage, C.C. Mehta discusses the performance of Shakespearean plays in Gujarati performed by Parsi actors. What he says is, be that man, there is no disputing that in those halcyon days of Parsi theatre, Shakespeare had a place second to none as far as scripts were concerned. In the field of acting and direction, the historical style prevailed as a result of influence of Victorian flourishes of the English touring companies, who invariably produced Shakespeare's plays in Bombay. Also, Catherine Hansen says that out of total of 80 printed plays identified in the British Library and newspaper notices, 35 are in Gujarati and 45 are in Hindustani or Gujarati. However, this Urdu category includes 17 plays published in Urdu language written in the Gujarati script. This sample undoubtedly underrepresents the number of published plays. Nonetheless, of 80 plays, 44% were published in Gujarati, 21% in Urdu printed in Gujarati script, and 35% in Urdu and Arabic script. So, from the above discussion, based on C.C. Mehta and Catherine Hansen's readings, we can conclude that during mid-19th century, Shakespeare and Parsi theatre played a significant role to create literature and translations in Gujarati from prominent English plays, where Shakespeare was at the highest. Now, Gujarati translation of Shakespearean plays in printed form, or the textual translation, started appearing only from 1898. These were adaptations which were performances. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Burkar Thakur and R.V. Pathak wanted to see Shakespeare rendered in Gujarati and lamented about how major Gujarati poets have failed to usher in Shakespeare in Gujarati. According to Hansa Mehta and Burkar Thakur, Gujarati poets have been aloof from Shakespeare and he is not at all celebrated in the context of Gujarati language and literature. I here quote Hansa Mehta's words from the first edition of her preface of her translation of Hamlet, which was published in 1942. She says, I am reading my translation. She has written that in Gujarati. So what she says is, but as Professor Burkar Thakur has said that because of some reasons, our prominent poets have always been aloof from Shakespeare, it is a matter of great loss for Gujarat. Sri Ramnarayan Bhai has also shown grievance towards this. In his newly published book, he writes that our young writers many times translate the naive words, but they have not shown any interest to translate the works of well-known playwrights like Shakespeare. It is a ponderable matter for me. So from the above lines of the preface written by Hansa Mehta, it can be assumed that these Gujarati translators and scholars completely ignored the fact that during mid-19th century, that is just around 50 years ago, Parsi theatre and other Natak Mandalis played a major role to constitute the role of Shakespeare in Gujarati literature. So from the above discussion, it can be noted that the Gujarati translator completely ignored Parsi performances. There could be many reasons, such as they did not consider performance or oral translations as a part of Gujarati translated literatures. The other reason could be Hindustani or Urdu Gujarati, which is spoken by Parsis, would have not been considered by this translator and critics as a part of Gujarati language and literature. My second part of the paper deals with standardization of Gujarati literature through creating norms for translations, as in what can be and what cannot be considered as translation. It is possible to say that why Burkar Thakur, Hansa Mehta and other Gujarati critics did not consider it important or ignored the role of Parsi performances played to constitute Gujarati literature and translations of Shakespearean plays in Gujarati. Most of the Shakespearean plays performed by Parsi theatre were adaptations. Adaptations were criticized or were considered as an inferior form as well as a work of piece that diversify the whole history, as it was not considered or seen as permissible act to change settings, names or characters. One such example is Apabai Bodhabai Apalal Motilal Patel's translation. He was one of the literary figures who wrote 6 adaptations of Shakespearean plays in Gujarati. In the prefaces of adaptations, he says that to create a Hindi atmosphere, he altered the names of the characters and settings of the play. They were all fictional setting and names of the characters which had no relations with history or historical figures. It was just to create fictional characters which were based on historical figures. Also, Ramanlal Desai is one among well-known early 20th century Gujarati poets, playwrights, and critics who played a major role in grounding early 20th century Gujarati literature. He wrote a preface entitled Bebol for the first edition of Kanan Kallol, in which he congratulates Apabai Bodhabai Patel on creating a masterpiece by creating this adaptation. But here R.B. Desai, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are very much audible.
Hello?
Please continue. Please continue. You are audible.
All right. So, Ramanlal Desai, in the preface to of Kanan Kallol by Apabai Bodhabai Patel, he writes that Kanan Kallol, I'm writing my English translation, he has written in Gujarati. Kanan Kallol is translation of the famous Shakespearean play, As You Like It. Shakespeare is considered as world dramatist. His translations require high responsibility. In that also, Mr. Apabai has Gujarati-nized in an appropriate way. He has portrayed Duke Senior as Ram Mandlik, Duke Frederick as Ras Antal. Both the daughters, who are female protagonists and deuterogonists, have been portrayed as Anuradha and Sohini. Even scenes are Gujarati-nized. Garden, fort or palace, forest, grove, and hut are not unknown to us. In Gujarat, there have been places in great number, and apart from that, it has many counties which introduce us to the royal culture. Combatants like Vajraketu and Oga Sankar, the village priest, play a significant role to create Gujarati atmosphere. But when the second edition comes, Apabai Bodhabai Patel in the preface writes that though it has not been a long since my adaptation's first edition, by amount of praise I am receiving from everyone, Tandav Nritya makes me believe that readers will like my other adaptations as well as it comes to be true. I would consider myself honored. But when the review that we see from the audience, he writes, in the review of the first edition, he writes that in the previous preface, I forgot to mention that in my adaptation, the historical figures and places where have mentioned is to create Hindi atmosphere have no relations with history. They are all fictional and solely created to reflect historical atmosphere. A critic has reviewed this is not a permissible act and you cannot diversify the history. This is a subject of argumentation which must be left to discuss later since this is not an appropriate platform. Plus, I have revealed the needed information in brief. So here what we see is that there are various views from others that adaptation cannot be considered as a part of the translation. Adaptations are good to, create a translations. So in this way, it can be said that these adaptations played a significant role to constitute the history of native or regional Gujarati literature. But when it comes to the adaptations that were done by Parsi theatre, they are completely ignored. Here also there are various views that adaptation cannot be considered as a part of the literature because you cannot diversify the history. So these adaptations no more remain inferior to original works of an author, but a significant part of the target culture text, which is Gujarati literature here. These adaptations cannot also be ignored for the history of translation. From the above discussion about the distinction between translation and adaptation, we can speculate that there is no single view that follows the same argumentation. Each and every writer or a critic or a translator treated adaptations in their own ways. Few of them considered them as a part of the translation where others did not, which led to create standardization of literature. For some critics and translators, adaptation was a creative piece of work, where for others it is just an inferior work. Now I'm coming to the third part of my paper, how standardization of language through the debate about the use of form in translation was used. So through the period from late 19th century to mid 20th century, scholars debate about the form of translation, whether it should be translated in form of verse, that is padya in Gujarati, whether to translate in prose, that is gadya in Gujarati, or in mix, that is prose poetry. It is known as gadya padyatma. Which one is more close to the original work? So when translators or critic write the preface to this translation, there is a huge debate that is going on. In order to replace Shakespeare's blank words with the Gujarati equivalent, different Gujarati translators have tried different approaches. N.P. Dave, Narbashankar Pranshankar Dave, has written his plays in form of prose. Hansa Mehta maintained it as words translation and employed a meter called Anushtup Chand to render Shakespeare's play into Gujarati. Krishnashankar Ambashankar Vyas has used Gadya Padyatmak translation, a translation that is in both, written in prose and can be recited in 2 words. In preface to Hansa Mehta's translation of Hamlet, Baka Thakur criticizes the translation of Shakespeare written before Hansa Mehta in form of prose. He goes to an extent by saying that we do have translation of Shakespeare in Gujarati because it is much difficult. We do not have translations of Shakespeare in Gujarati because it is very much difficult to maintain the blank words of Shakespeare. Throughout the preface, Baka Thakur celebrates Hansa Mehta's translation of Shakespeare by stating that it is the first proper translation of Shakespearean play because she has attempted it to translate in Anushtup Chand. What he writes is, by criticizing these translations that were not done before Hansa Mehta, it seems that Baka Thakur acknowledges only poets have rights to translate, and that only in verse form. Because from this, it is also becomes the question who should really translate. Are only poets allowed to translate, or others can translate? He further in the same preface argues that there are no such books recorded in the book list. That was in this book list as a Shakespearean translations, a retired professor of Bhavnagar College, who was Narbashankar Pranshankar Dave, and unknown to me Desai and Patel Maganlal's names and their translated plays are noted. This makes our Shakespearean translators as 4 or 5, but they have not translated it in words, so it cannot be considered as close to Shakespeare. This is what the critic argues. So from the conclusion that Baka Thakur draws in preface to Hansa Mehta's translation, it seems that Thakur is of a view that only Anushtup Chand, which is closer to Shakespeare's blank words, while concluding his preface, Baka Thakur says that I conclude with an urge to make a simple comparison to my friends in opposition. Before this, Hamlet has been translated only once, which is by Narbashankar Pranshankar Dave. This work, the writer was also a MS scholar with years of experience as a professor of philosophy in college and skillful in writing English literature in Gujarati. When they compare this to their translation, the liveliness and similarities will be obvious from page to page. Here it becomes argumentative when the same translator supports 2 opposite views together. Even though Hansa Mehta seems hopeful in preface to her translation Hamlet, in preface to her second translation, Hansa Mehta goes to an extent by saying that Anushtup Chand is not a proper meter from blank words. And she says that now we have to find another meter. So again, the question comes that how should the translation, which kind of the meter should be used while translating Shakespeare, which creates which gives us a scope to create new meters in Gujarati, which is a part of the language. On one side, Baka Thakur acknowledges Hansa Mehta's use of Anushtup Chand for equivalent to Shakespeare's blank words, where on the other side, Krishnalal Ambasankar Vyas is of a view that just words, that is Gadya in Gujarati, is not a proper equivalent for blank words. For him, Gadya Padyatmak, that is work that is in prose but carries the rhythm of words. He criticizes Hansa Mehta and other translators in his preface to his translation of The Merchant of Venice, which is entitled as Venice no Vepari. In his preface to The Merchant of Venice, reveals the reason for attempting a translation by saying that this Hansa Mehta has translated Shakespearean play in Gujarati in Anushtup meter and published them. A few years back, a professor from MTB Arts College, Surat, also translated 2 or 3 plays of Shakespeare and published them. At the same time, Dr. Madhusudan Parekh from HK Arts College, Ahmedabad, has also translated Shakespearean plays. Among these, none has translated into Gadya Padyatmak, that is prose poetry form. Because of this, the readers of Gujarat are not able to enjoy the Shakespearean plays at its best. From a long time, I have felt that it would, if we could overcome this need, the quality of Gujarati literature would be enhanced. So, in 1963-1964, I translated the play The Merchant of Venice in Gadya Padyatmak, prose poetry form, and entitled it Venice no Vipari. So, from the above discussion, we can conclude that the prefaces of Gujarati translations and adaptations played a key role to establish the norms and rules for translated Shakespearean plays in Gujarati, which helps to standardize Gujarati language and literature. These translation adaptations is a great role in constituting Gujarati literature and translation. The adaptation of Shakespearean plays seem to succeed in constituting the regional, that is Gujaratified or localized plays based on Shakespearean words, and these plays created a wide variety of plays for Gujarati stage. I think I conclude my paper over here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Jeevani, for a wonderful presentation. Generally, I was just reminded, when you was listening to you, you are in Karnataka, this Parsi theatre seems to have played a very important role in popularizing Shakespeare and rendering a lot of translations. I think basically these Parsi theatres were investors. They were sort of companies which would stage a Shakespearean play across the state or across, let's say, Bombay Presidency and various presidencies during the colonial period. Yeah, and most of it because they didn't want them to be in, let's say, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Very much.
Yeah. So since they didn't want them to be in English because the English, the population which was using English was very minimal, so they adopted them and translated them to various local languages. So that's exactly how Shakespeare got translated into Kannada, and they adopted it and Kannadized it in sort of, instead of calling Othello, yes, can you, yeah. They, called it a Vigada Vikramaraya. Yeah. Yes.
They were commercial companies basically, and they did not publish any kind of translation. They were just performances.
Yeah, in fact, they adopted the translations that were available. They localized, particularly in Kannada, Shakespeare. Most of the Kannada renderings were done in Kannada, and they were all performed in by Parsi theatres, actually speaking. They were actually production houses. So this is something very interesting because we share a very Karnataka. We share
are these available in Kannada?
Karnataka. I'm talking about Karnataka. I mean, I'm just drawing a parallel to what you were saying.
Yeah, that I got it. What I'm asking is, the scripts available?
Yeah. Lot of these adaptations were done in Kannada by a lot of local writers. Instead of Othello, they called it Vigada Vikramaraya Charitre and things like that. So the multiple. I mean, I can't recall most of those things, but I remember there's a long history of that tradition also in Kannada. Okay. Anyway, generally I was trying to draw a parallel. Anyway, all the presentation was extraordinary and good, very impressive. And all the presentations highlight on the complexities of knowledge production during colonial period, the question of power, agency, local colonial power equations are probed by all the presentators. Knowledge production during these days, these colonial, ambience under this colonial always is essentially a collaborative effort, and by both the imperial power as well as the local dominant groups. So I believe all the scholars have dealt extensively on those issues. And we have around 5 minutes for discussion if the papers are open for discussion. In case if anyone has any interesting or any question to ask, please be specific. You just have 5 minutes. Please, you are welcome to ask questions. Unmute yourself and ask questions.
May I ask a question to Ivy and Uma, if the chair permits?
Please, sir. Please, sir. Go ahead. Identify yourself. Identify yourself.
I'm Vijay Borati, University Union College of University of Mysore. I'm an associate professor in English department. My first question is related to the presentation made by Uma. The term that you employ in your presentation, like recovery, what does it mean? Are we trying to recover the agencies which are actually who have not disappeared in the annals of vernacular writings, but only in the research that we come across over last 20 years in the field of colonial knowledge production or colonialism or Orientalism? What exactly we are trying to do that? The second question, you make reference to Tejaswi Niranjana's work as a backdrop. Your presentation doesn't endorse it or critique it. I am wondering why. Why is it that? Why are you silent about that backdrop? And thirdly, it's a question addressed to Ivy. Ivy's presentation is trying to retrieve collaborator in the colonial knowledge production. But some of the details that she furnishes in her presentation contradict her the term collaboration, because the collaborator Murbu seems to be, according to presentation, was not a passive onlooker, or he was not a dependent on colonial mechanism. He was also an independent scholar. He was not a passive onlooker. So is it right to consider such agencies as collaborator? And lastly, what are the implications of such studies in understanding the theories of colonialism, Orientalism, knowledge production? Because all the four presentations are quite interesting, and they have brought out the complexity of colonialism, as the chairperson remarked just now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So my idea of using the term recovery was in the sense of giving due credit, giving back what is due to the translators, because as we have discussed in the colonial period, these Dubashas had contributed significantly to knowledge production. But as a result of historical processes, their work has gone unacknowledged. So, in fact, Maridas Pule's has gone doubly unacknowledged, in the sense that not only he, the French person who commissioned the translation, refused to acknowledge him and then accused him of giving his work to others, but also in the historical sense, because the observations that were made based on his translation by other French scholars, that was also not given. So I used recovery in that sense, sir. And as far as Tejaswi Niranjana's goes, I was just referring to her observation of translation that happens within asymmetrical relations of power, highlighting colonialism. So she has based herself on Foucault to draw this conclusion, and since we are witnessing the same phenomenon in this particular case, so I have used it in that sense. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, may I answer now? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, please, Ivy. Go ahead.
Okay, yes. So yes, the question is quite interesting. Now, the first part of it, which is the use of collaborator, is that a suitable word? Now, I think that the paper actually looks at the way alternative words are being used. Words are being used, in words that are, they're trying to find an alternative terminology for native informant. So, in recent times, the word native informant has got a derogatory sense. So, therefore, as a result of that, these alternative terms are being used by the new writers, the writers who come, in the 80s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. So, you have the word collector that is used. Sometimes the word collaborator is used, sometimes co-worker is used. So these other words, perhaps they're not completely, do not express the kind of role that they might have played. And yes, even author has been used. But the fact is that they do have this function. They try to bring give a greater agency to the native informant. The native informant was someone whose identity was completely erased. But when you give use the terminology collaborator or author or collector, then you try to give a greater agency. So therefore, I think that is preferable to the word informant. Native informant right now is not considered to be, as I've said, it has a derogatory connotation. Okay. Second part of it, which was on the contradiction, I really did not get it. Can you please repeat it? Boretti, Vijay?
Vijay Boretti.
No, on the one hand, you say that Murmu was a collaborator. On the other, you also make a remark that he was independent. He was not a passive onlooker. So,
well, I have used the word ambiguous. There is this situation is not actually very clear because he does report what he was writing. He was talking to these people who were telling him stories, giving the stories, folk tales, and then he was writing them down. So he was at one level, he was acting as a reporter. Yes, he was writing down everything faithfully. But at the same time, he was also adding to this. And he was adding some comments. He was, moralizing sometimes. He was also taking, an active, playing an active role by interpreting the interpretative process. He was part of the interpretative process. So therefore, this is a very ambiguous role that he played. He was not clearly, you cannot pin him down. That's why I conclude by saying it's very difficult to pin him down. He is he an author? Is he just a native, a passive native informant, or is he an author? Is he more than that? Is he also sort of giving a counter narrative? So this is something which I think needs to be studied more. Yes. So this is, I think there's a question mark at the end. And thank you for the question. It's very interesting.
Lakshmi Haribandi has a question. Please, Lakshmi, go ahead and ask your question. You raised your hand.
My question is to Jai Jeevan. This is regarding his presentation. As the chair rightly pointed out, I can even draw parallels with the Telugu scenario of Shakespeare's translations. I think most of the languages have the same pattern. Many adaptations and a few literal translations were made of Shakespeare's dramas. Almost all Shakespeare's dramas are available in Telugu translation, majority in adaptations and a very few in literal translations. And my question to him is, like, I'm trying to understand his title, how Shakespeare's translation of Shakespeare's plays help in standardizing Gujarati language and literature, because one, he said adaptations were considered an inferior form. Generally, by adapting something, history tells us that you enrich your literature and language by adapting literatures, well-established literatures. But here, adaptations were considered inferior. And also he mentioned that many of these paratexts or introductions to their translations, they had a great influence. So in that context, I would like to know from him whether there were many more adaptations, whether adaptations outnumbered literal translations or literal translations outnumbered adaptations, and what were the norms? Like, who were these people who were saying adaptations are inferior or literal translations are superior, or it's not Gujarati, this kind of translation is not Shakespearean Gujarati, etc. Who are these people who are passing such judgment, who are influential in influencing the translations?
Got it, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, really interesting question, ma'am. Thank you for your question. So what happens over here is this Bakar Thakur I talked about. I'll start with one of the examples, Bakar Thakur. He is the major poet, celebrated poet in Gujarati literature. Whenever Gujarati literature comes in your mind, Bakar Thakur is one of the poets. And he is also a critic. So there is this poetess who has translated Hansa Mehta's Hamlet. Hansa Mehta. She has translated Hamlet. Now, before that, there were various translations of Shakespeare. One of them is Hamlet by Narbashankar Pranshankar Dave. Now, he had translated it in a prose, and Hansa Mehta has translated it in words. That is, she has used the meter called Anustup Chand. Now, this poet says that now the very first time we are having the Shakespeare in Gujarati literature. This poet, who is the most famous celebrated poet, he writes a preface and he says that now we are having Shakespeare in Gujarati literature. So what he does is basically he is creating a norm for literature, that how should it be translated. What it does is it standardizes in language and literature, that you should have to use Anustup Chand to translate it. So what it does is it gives you the idea of that, yes, now we are having Gujarati meter and we should use that. Another one is, he says that adaptations are not, there were many Parsi performances, they were adaptations and they were translated, when they were performed it was Parsi or Hindu Gujarati. So they are ignoring that Hindu Gujarati, Parsi Gujarati and adaptation. So what it does is it creates a new kind of literature that no, this Hindu Gujarati is not Gujarati, this Brahmin Gujarati, that it creates a very typical norm that yes, this is English because other like words that are taken from other languages are not English. So what it does, it standardizes one thing. It standardizes meter, it standardizes language, it standardizes literature. And this was the contribution of these translations. Again, if you see this Apa Bhai Bhoda Bhai Patel, what he says is now it should be translated in Gadya Padyatmak. So what it means is they are creating norms for language, they are creating norms for literature. And this is how the standardization happens. Ma'am, you are not audible.
They were also creating translation norms.
Yes.
They were also, yeah.
These translation norms are a way to standardizing literature and language.
Yes, yes. Very good, very good.
I think we are running short of time. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, last question by Nina Gogate. She's been waiting. Nina, please go ahead. It will be the last question probably. Yes.
Very good morning to everyone. And I have a very quick question for Uma. Uma, if you have already mentioned this, please, I apologize, since I have been facing a lot of network problems and I may have missed a sentence here or there in your presentation. I was just wondering that when you spoke about how when Pillai made multiple translations, we see that his agency goes on increasing, like his sense of empowerment goes on increasing as time passes by, and the translations themselves undergo a process of, let us say, large change. As you explained, some of the first ones were they had 2 books. The last one was less than 200 pages long, if I'm not incorrect, to say, if I remember correctly. Then are there sources available, or is there material available which could guide us as to know what how this entire change and these multiple translations and took place, in the sense that what was it his own decision to make these changes, to, or a process of self-editing as time went along, or was it based on the demand from the European, let us say, the colonizers that he was working for, the limitations on number of pages or cherry picking of content, etc. So is there any way to research this aspect of Pillai's work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, actually, I didn't speak much about the translation as such because I wanted to focus more on the controversy and the way the interaction happened with Fouché Dobsongi. So actually, see, the Bhagavata Purana is written, it's a huge volume of 10 books, like I said, and it's written in Sanskrit. But there are multiple versions which have been orally and textually transmitted to other languages. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, there are a lot of oral traditions which related to the Bhagavata Purana, and Bhagavatam it's called. And there have been attempts to date the text which which Maridas Pillai used for his translation. So, for example, the scholars who have worked on who have examined his translation, they have identified some words in it, like Tulukar and like Mlecha, which apparently existed only after the 14th century. So they are quite sure that the text which was used by Maridas Pillai must have dated after the 14th century, whereas the Purana itself dates to the 11th or the 10th century. So there is a discrepancy in the original, well, if you can call it original, because the Sanskrit version itself has undergone multiple changes, and the Tamil version, which is slightly more recent comparatively. So that is one thing. And there is no version available of this particular manuscript which he worked on, though in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris there is a manuscript, a Tamil manuscript, which scholars say that this is the one which was used by Maridas Pillai. So that is one way to identify. Apart from that, regarding your other question about his translations. So the first translation was commissioned by Fouché d'Hobsonville, who was a naturalist who lived in India. And Maridas made a first translation which he passed on to him, but he was not satisfied, as I said. And it was on his own initiative that he undertook the next translation of the Purana. But again, this is an abridged version. So the version which we have today is an abridged version. There are two abridged versions. One was published in 1921 by the Father Hostin, and the second one was the 2004 edition. And as far as the multiple translations go, it was the first version of which he made several copies, and he sold to, we don't know how many people. Definitely he sold one to Pierre Sonera, because that work has been incorporated into Pierre Sonera's work. But again, it is not the full work, it's parts of the work. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, in fact, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I, on behalf of the Department of Translation, EFLU, thank all the participants and as well as the scholars who made their presentations. It was a wonderful present. All the four presentations extraordinarily scholarly. And I wish we had more time so that we could have more discussions. Unfortunately, we're running short of time. I think there's one more session coming up. So thank you very much. I hope to meet you in the next session. Thank you very much.
Before going to the other session, I would like to thank our sincere thanks to Professor Dattatreya Malappa for being the chair of this session. Thank you very much, sir. We extend our gratitude to the paper presenters for your interesting presentations. We are grateful participants and the live stream viewers for the active participation and cooperation in the success of this session. My special thanks to all our professors and my dear friends for your support in many ways. Thank you very much all. Have a good day ahead. The 8th session will begin in a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Begin the next session.
Pragya?
Is there a problem?
Tarakeshwar, what's the problem? Professor Vijay Kumar is not present.
No, both of them are present.
Then
You're
why,
waiting
who
for
is the
Kanpur.
anchor? Who is the comparer? Pragya?
Okay, welcome all of you to this session where we are going to listen to Professor GJV Prasad. Now we will have a short video introducing Professor GJV Prasad.
Minutes.
Dr. GJV Prasad is a well-known academic, critic, novelist, translator, and poet from India. He worked as a professor at the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has also served as visiting professor at Grinnell College, University of Essex, University of Hyderabad, and University of Paris. Apart from teaching in various reputed universities, he has also served as the director of Jawaharlal Nehru Institute of Advanced Study. He was appointed as the chairperson of the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He was selected as a member of the Executive Committee of the Indian Association for the Study of Australia, IASA, in 2006. His research interests include Anglophone writing, theatre and post-colonial readings of performance, contemporary British theatre, Indian English literature spanning all genres, Indian literatures, translation theory, questions of representation and identity construction. Some of his notable works include Writing India, Writing English, Literature, Language, Location, brought out by Routledge in 2011. An anthology of Indian English literature, co-edited with Professor Renu Bharadwaj. Continuities in Indian English poetry, Nation, Language, Form, India in Translation, Translation in India, Translation and Culture, Indian Perspectives, Violets in a Crucible, Translating the Orient by Susan Blatz, G.J.V. Prasad and Madhu Benoit. For his translation work, he was bestowed with a Katha Award for Translation for his translations from Tamil into English in 1998. Later, he received Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship to visit London as well as to attend Cambridge Writers' Conference in 1995.
Thank you so much for the AV Ramakrishnan. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome Professor T. Vijay Kumar. Dr. T. Vijay Kumar is currently teaching at BITS Pilani, Hyderabad campus. Formerly, he was Professor and Head, Department of English and Dean, Faculty of Arts, Osmania University, Hyderabad. Besides critical studies and textbooks, his publications include translations from Telugu, Kanya Sukulam, an early 20th century classic by Gurujada Venkata Appa Rao, and The Liberation of Sita by Volga. He is a TEDx speaker, a founder director of the annual Hyderabad Literary Festival, and a founder editor of Muse India, a literary e-journal. I welcome you, sir, and I request you to please take over the session.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session by G.J.V. Prasad. And I also thank Tarkeshwar for asking me to chair this session. I think without much further ado, we should allow the speaker to address. And I was quite, as one can expect from GJV, the title is, terrific. Discovering India through translation. Obviously, he's invoking Nehru. Not only in the title, but I suppose also in the concept, the idea of India that Nehru, in a way, symbolizes. And I look forward to listening to Professor G.J.V. Prasad. Professor Prasad.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Kumar. Can I continue calling you Vijay? Thank you, Vijay. Vijay Kumar and I go back a long way. It's a pleasure to be with him on this, today, and also slightly terrifying because Vijay is such a wonderful critical listener and reader that one is always on test when he's chairing a session. When Tarakeshwar asked me whether I would be willing to speak and participate in this conference, again, I was slightly hesitant because of Tarakeshwar, another critical listener and reader. And I said, you guys want to put me on test all the time. And he said, no, you must speak. And I said, all right, I'll do it. Discovering India came automatically from the concept note for the conference. And I said, oh, yes, of course. When you're looking at the nation, when you're trying to reconstitute the nation, when you're thinking of how to go about this in terms of translation and translation studies. Discovering India is almost axiomatic, which is why we are in the field of translation, which is what we do all the time. I may seem slightly superficial today because even though I see many friends here, even though I see people who are very good in the field, I also, and because I see them, and because I see the papers that were read so far, and I see the papers that are going to be read immediately after this session, also the fact that you have such wonderful plenary speakers, and I love being framed at one end by Sherry Simon and the other end by Harish Trivedi. Brilliant. I can actually afford to be a bit superficial. That's the point I was making, because you're getting the nitty-gritties all the time anyway. One has to start with what everybody knows, which is that India is a nation born in translation. India is a nation of translation. India cannot be otherwise, because it's even if you want me to go even further back than start with India as a nation of translation, very quickly we know that that human language is translation. To name is translation. It's a basic human activity. That's how languages are born. We name, we communicate our ideas of the material world outside or any world that we think of in language, which then is accepted, circulates. So all utterances, all languages are translations. All science systems, in a sense, are translations. So we know that that's a basic that I must say. So when and then we realize that when people interact with each other, when different linguistic cultures interact with each other, we need translation in the way we think of translation, which is from one language to another language, basic ideas of translation. But this will happen, unless this happens, cultures cannot ever talk to each other, cannot ever mingle with each other. And that's basic, that's the axiomatic of the world. The world comes together in translation. And when we say that, it comes together in translation, we form cultural linkages, we form worldviews, we influence each other's knowledge systems. And when we do that, and of course, trade and commerce happens in translation. And when all this happens, great cultures are born, because great cultures are born in translation. It's with seeding of ideas from elsewhere that things happen, new things happen. And it should be obvious again, as I started off, that in a multilingual country, we should take this for granted. India is a major site for translation. It's a political, if you think of it, a political, civilizational, and cultural area that has formed and reformed in terms of translation, in terms of traffic between languages. As Sujit Mukherjee, and I like quoting him, as Sujit Mukherjee once said famously, that perhaps the idea of Indian literature is to be found only in translation. The idea of India itself is to be found only in translation. We are, as I said, not just multilingual because of our constitution's definition. We are multilingual in terms of our constituents, what goes to make the nation. And it is, and again, I'm quoting myself. I love this line. I don't even know how I came up with it. Maybe interaction with Jay. India, it is not Manuvad that unites India. It's Anuvad. So we, as I said, our notions of translation are therefore also quite different from the Western notions of translation. But I'm not going to make big of that at the moment, because it's not mainly pertinent to my talk, except to say that for us, translation has always been a resonance, a replaying with a different instrument, if you wish, a commentary, a piece of rewriting, a conversation. This is what I want to emphasize. That for us, translation is an act of conversation, an act of reifying ideas found in other languages, an act of interacting with other texts, an act of interacting and conversing with other cultures. This is, I think, basically our idea of translation. And if you think of India as a civilization area, you can see this happening with the epics, you can see this happening with Ramayana, how it travels, changes, travels back, changes, how it influences people. So it's a conversation happening between peoples. This conversation contributed to the effect to form the consciousness of the modern nation state during the national movement. Such a conversation was happening in recent times as well, within various languages, in trying to imagine India into existence. So there was translation in traffic, as we know, there may not have been a national literature, but there was a nationalist literature. And this network of translation and new writing was a kind of conversation people to form this country. And this, of course, is now when you think about it, we can also say how this translation is what between languages, various Indian languages, has become a translation from various Indian languages now into English mostly. This is, of course, made more interesting by globalization, by the idea of the world coming together, etc., etc. But the hegemony of English, if you wish. But and also, as many of us note with dismay, the amount of impact English as a language has on various Indian languages. But we should also notice how much impact our various Indian languages have on our various Indian Englishes. It's a two-way traffic. It's never a one single-way traffic. Right. So, and again to emphasize, in India, translation is an everyday activity. It is at every level of class, in cities, if you wish, in villages where you have, in small towns where you have migrant labor as well now. So it's not just big cities. People are translating in border towns of states. People are translating all the time, all the time. So in a sense, a lot of translation activity is everyday activity, decisions taken on which word to use, which word to introduce into a language by individuals. So it's a plain, it's a infinity, of course, huge number of decisions taken by individuals every day that goes into making of this translation, of languages that we do, how we translate, what we retain, what we don't retain. It's also institutional. So it's very difficult. It sounds a little chaotic. How do we even talk about translation with any certitude here? What's happening with the languages? But what I'm saying is intuitively true, that all of us are involved in this act, not just institutionally, but individually. So as I said, let's just look at the nation for some more time. As a nation of translation, we know that India itself is not a name given to ourselves by us. India is a name given to us by outsiders. So the name of the nation is born in translation, because Sindhu becomes Indus, Hindu. From there you get Hindu, and there you get people who live next to Indus are Hindus, and as Indus travels to other languages, then the people who live in this country are, which is called by India, I think first by Herodotus, India, and then Indians. And as you know, the language, it's all Indus, Sindhu changing name to Hindu to Indus, and you get Indians. And so even the name Hindu comes from elsewhere. So majority community gets name from elsewhere. The country gets its name from elsewhere, and people are very aware of this in the Constituent Assembly debates. They knew there is India is a name which had not been, it was not a name that we gave ourselves. It's a name given by others. So there's a huge debate in the Constituent Assembly as to what we should call ourselves. And people say it should be called, of course, the Constitution calls us India, that is Bharat. Will be a union of states. All these has been in contention now. But India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. And you know that the debate was whether we should be called India, that is Bharat. So nation born in translation, two languages being given to India, that is Bharat, in the Constitution itself. But should we not call ourselves Bharat, that is India? Should we not, so should we be Bharat first? Should we not say Bharat, that is called India in English? Should we not say Bharat, that is India in foreign languages? These are all suggestions made by Constituent Assembly members, that we should emphasize somewhere that India is foreign to us. And interestingly, the name Bharat itself, is brought in instead of Hindustan, and that's interesting in itself. Discovering India, right? Hindustan. Why not Hindustan? Why not Hindustan? Because Hindustan, as all of us know, was the name given to Mughal Muslim India. So if you moved from even Maharashtra, when you went up north, from Maharashtra, you went to Hindustan. So the idea of a Muslim Hindustan was anathema to the people of the Constituent Assembly. Pakistan was separate. And by the way, that's an interesting thing in itself, because when Pakistan goes separate, one of the questions that happens is and you can see this in South Asian departments as well. What is India? Is India the undivided India of before partition, or the India that is the major part of the subcontinent that's left after the partition? Pakistan would have liked India to change its name, saying India from before, but Indians felt, the Constituent Assembly members felt, that India was not the one which seceded. It's Pakistan which went separate. So they can call themselves whatever they want, and we are India. And therefore, in a sense, a legitimacy of continuity, etc., etc. but they still needed an Indian name. And the Indian name could not be Hindustan because it's Muslim and because it was also, interestingly, appropriated by the Hindu right wing. Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. So to avoid the complete Hindu right wing use of Hindustan and to avoid the Muslim use connections to Hindustan, they went for a pre-Islamic name. And so you go backwards and you come up with Bharat. Interestingly, as I read through the debates, almost all the time when they're speaking, they speak of themselves as belonging to Hindustan. They never say we, in fact, one of the members said we should call ourselves Bharatvash and we should Bharatvarshis. None of them say we're Bharatis or Bharatvarshis. They all call themselves Hindustanis, so much so that Constituent Assembly member from a particular state said, if you guys don't want India to be called Hindustan, we'll call our state Hindustan. It just shot down immediately. But so this business of naming, I'm emphasizing this to show that from the beginning of this, in terms of constitution, from the beginning in terms of what the country was called, we have won in translation. And as you read the debates, you also realize we represent we're a country of different linguistic cultures. And interestingly, each of the languages, the linguistic cultures they talk about, each of states they will come up with, they in themselves multilingual. They in themselves multicultural. Even though one language, one state, seems to have been the motto, you realize that people start questioning the fact that it's one language. And when you're on language, and very quickly I must say, by the way, this Bharat itself, I must grant that when people said Bharat, they were discovering or reconstituting their nation, their country. Because one of the things that strikes us is it going to be India for the elite, central, and Bharat for the desis? What is it going to be? And many of them are saying that centuries of bondage has done this to us. And we must rediscover ourselves, be confident in our culture, etc., etc. Lots of this is going to be played again and again over the 75 years of our existence as a nation state. Anyways, so I was talking about how when we say we are multilingual, we should get some statistics we must look at immediately to see how difficult it is to talk about India without understanding. Difficult to talk about India without understanding its complexity. In the 2011 census, they came up with 19,500 odd mother tongues. And then the census operations, what they did was to kind of break it down to about 1,900 odd languages and other languages, main languages. Then they further broke it down to 121 languages because they said, oh yeah, you call it the mother tongue, you say this, give this name, but actually it forms into this family. Then again break it down, and it actually is part of this language. As you know, about 50 odd languages make up Hindi. So you understand what I'm talking about. So you come up with 121 languages, of which 22 are the scheduled languages and 99 are non-scheduled languages. And remember, when we say something is a language in the census, it means more than 10,000 people speak it. There are lots of other languages, but they're not taken into account in this count. So what really happens here is that some languages are politically important. They constitute largely the idea of India, which is the 22 languages. Of the 90,000 odd languages, of the 2,000 odd languages spoken in a particular state, everything gets down to these 22 scheduled languages and 99 other languages which are fighting to be included in the schedule. And of course, you know that in the schedule, you have Hindi, but you don't have English, which is the associate official language of the country. And that you also know that English is the official or associate official language of actually a few more states and union territories than Hindi is. And that we have about 35 odd languages, which are official languages for states and union territories, but only 22 are in the schedule. So these are interesting things to know in order to be able to even talk about reconstituting, thinking about India. How do we do this? We cannot do this unless we take translation very seriously. Do we? You know that till date, the constitution is available in Hindi and English. And really, it's not been translated into other languages. So as citizens, people don't have access to the constitution in their own languages, and we're talking about so many languages now. How does how does it show that we take translation seriously? But why do we need translation even more? It's not just to make people converse with each other, not just to make the various peoples of a country converse with each other, but to actually be able to deliver them their rights, the equality that the Constitution promises. How can anybody be an equal citizen in this country unless you are able to speak to other people in the country, unless you're able to be your language and you are seen to be equal in the eyes of the Constitution, of the law, of everything, that you have clear access to all that the state can offer and know what the state can offer you. That is how you are a true citizen. That's how the state teaches a true citizen to speak your language to you, to hear your language from you. That is not happening yet. And I'm already going to be talking about something else. So this basic, our parliament cannot function if there's no translation interpretation. Very often it does not function well because some people can't speak Hindi or English and cannot find that they cannot speak in a different language unless they give prior notice and the translator interpreter has been found for them. So it's a difficult situation, but it's a difficult situation made more difficult because we don't see ourselves as a federal country, as a country of different languages, where the languages should be seen on an equal footing and translation services should be available to all. Translation should be the mantra of the nation. There are changes happening, but they're not happening fast enough. Right? So, and then to be truly inclusive, and we know this, and when they're coming from the literary field, we know how this is, the necessity that marginalized people, their voices, people who've been kept at periphery, their voices are heard. Their voices are heard in different Indian languages, and then come together so that actually first that you should learn heard in the language of your state if you wish, even though may not be your language, and then to be heard in other languages of the country, and perhaps that through Hindi, through English, go across. We know it's been done so successfully. It's more needs to be done, but that we have an idea of Dalit literatures. Still, I'm putting a little plural in it to show that there is the differences, but Dalit literature has come together in translation. There is a Dalit movement possible because of translation. There is a way of thinking about Dalit across the country that's possible because of translation, and it's happened. It's happened and happened quite well. This we see in terms of people questioning how language is used, how translation is necessary, how languages have to be resisted, have to be subverted. You can see this in Dalit literature. You can see this in feminist writing. So in the sense of, both are very aware that the standard language, and this is why we have to talk about intersectionality anyway, but the standard language oppresses, is patriarchal. But in our case, it's not just patriarchal, it's also casteist. It's also casteist. And it's also heteronormative. So there are lots of things that happen with language that have to be resisted. It is also ableist, because I'm going to be talking about mainly about the disability, persons with disability, how the representation of persons with disability, and the way they argue for their rights, their own experiences, their own representations have to be translated, have to reach across. We have to become a really inclusive nation. It can be only done if we show our awareness of various kinds of oppressions, various kinds of marginalizations, and carry on our translation work. Sorry, to time myself, I just need to every now and then look at the paper I've written so that I don't start getting carried away. So as I said, tribals, Dalits, women who have been marginalized, oppressed. We're talking about persons with disability. So many, and most of a lot of this is intersection. You can be a person with disability as a woman, as somebody who belongs to an oppressed caste or belonging to a tribal community. And you can, so in a sense, these are things that one has to study in terms of how they impact on each other. But first of all, let's have the resources. Let's have the translations in place. And that's one of the things that we don't seem to do at all. We seem to silence people. We are very good at silencing, marginalizing people, very rarely paying attention to what people themselves are saying, and not happy with critiquing representation. Though we are getting there, we're getting better at this. In terms of my career, I can say this. We need to, as I said, talk about the representation of persons with disability. We must give space to voices of activists, of course, the voices of people themselves, so that conversations can begin. And every one of us participates in the building of this inclusive space, the inclusive nation. Now, when you think about, no, of course, India has representation of disability. Our epics, the majority, the Hindu epics have representations of disability, etc. But when you think about more contemporary representation of disability, how many texts you know? You will run, I suggest, into a wall. You'll come up with very few, because that was our experience. And, it was, to give credit, it was Someshwar Sati, my collaborator in the project, who saw the translating disability and disability stories books in the video, which is a lovely video. Thank you very much for that, the audiovisual introduction. When you see, for those books came out of workshops. So Someshwar Sati came to me and said, and Someshwar was my PhD student as well. So years we've been talking about representations of disability, and didn't pay the attention or the consideration that was due. I admit it, because we've been talking about it for a decade and a half and never really done anything about it. And then he came one day and he said, this is 2016, and he said, we must take this forward. We must take this forward. We must hold a workshop. We must collect stories representing disability, and we must have them translated. So I like the idea. We actually then wrote to various friends, scholars, translation studies scholars in Indian literature. We wrote to them. We didn't get a very enthusiastic response, or very often we didn't get a response. But we said we still go ahead, because some people are encouraging. We said we'll go ahead and do the workshop. And we announced the workshop. And Someshwar remembers this as bewildering. He said, in his words, people looked at us as if we were insane. They looked at us in a bewildered manner, because they felt, what are you even doing? Indian literatures and various Indian languages don't have representations of disability. You won't find anything. And actually, we got quite a few reactions like that, saying, no, this is not going to happen. I cannot, I know this language well. I can't think of texts which represent disability. So, in essence, of disability texts, we don't know them. And some, of course, very enthusiastic, who said, if you find any, let us know, because we'd like to take part in the translation, if you find any. But as we were almost giving up, we kept sending these notices around. And suddenly, interest picked up. And when we had the workshop, there were about 80 short stories brought to the workshop from 12 different languages, 80 short stories. And the interesting thing about these 80 stories, and we asked the people who came in, there was a lovely workshop. I was not, unfortunately, be able to participate in workshops, but which had long chats with people separately. I had, and I heard reports of the workshop itself, and that many people looked at these texts, had not looked at these texts, which they knew well, as disability texts at all. They'd seen them in other terms, as aesthetic objects doing other things. You know, just to give you an example, I mean, not an example, names of people who stories figured prominently in this workshop. Rabindranath Tagore, Sadat Hasan Manto, Bashir, Dharamveer Bharati. I mean, how would people not know that these writers had texts on disability? But they had not read them as that. So whereas writers themselves had been sensitive, aware of the issues, the readers, the academics had not seen them in those terms. People who translated these texts earlier had not seen these texts in those terms. So again, it's an interesting thing that we are unaware, we don't see many things in life, and we can say, oh, as we do, people who say we're caste blind, don't have an awareness of what caste means. People, you know, who say these things. So people say who don't see disability because they are unaware, completely unaware of what disability means. So this workshop was fantastic for very many reasons. In terms of consciousness raising, and in terms of establishing or thinking, making people think about disability studies, this notion of disability studies, and to think about it, to think how they could be part of this. But, you know, I must quickly, because we're talking translation, and I'm looking for the page here, I must quickly say that when we talk about disability, we are talking about, again, a history of ways of talking about disability, of translation. I should start off by saying translation itself is an enabling act which addresses a disability. I know Somesh will say, sir, you are generalizing too much. But the fact is that when we translate, we are enabling someone who does not know the language of the first text to be able to understand, read that text. So you are addressing a disability that the reader has, and you are enabling that reader to overcome that disability to access that text. This is, so basically, translation addresses disability. Translation is an enabling act. If we start thinking in terms of how we can create spaces, enabling spaces, accessible spaces for each other, we are right on the way to working towards inclusiveness. You know, because as we know, our disability is, as when I say you don't know language, you know, disabilities are then created by chauvinism, by certain kinds of education systems, by national borders. You know, you want to speak that language, go to that country kind of nonsense. You want to stay in my country, you speak this language kind of nonsense, right? So it's, you know, it's, you can see that it's not us who are born disabled. That is, all of us are born disabled. It's that we are not had enabling environments. So it is that environment, the social environment, cultural environment that is disabling for us. So, you know, poor people cannot have access to education. So you are actually, there are various kinds of accesses denied on basis of who you are, where you are, gender, caste, you know, poverty, all kinds of things, and they all intersect with each other. So we have to obviously, you know, almost be activist in our interventions here. In terms of education, as well as academics, we have to be more you know, interventionist in terms of how we spread education, how we take education to people, and what education means to us, right? But what we were looking for, as I said, was to also, I didn't say this, but we also wanted to make people not, this is what is follow, we didn't want people to think of disability as simply medical terms, simply in terms of therapy. So we wanted to move them out, think about disability in terms of social terms, which is what I'm talking about. Right? That the translation itself is enabling. So when we talk about enabling, you should realize that when the term itself, disability itself, persons with disability that I am using, is a term that we arrived at after a lot of debate. You know how our Indian languages work. That's how every language works in the world. You know, when we talk about disability and disabled people, Are, Nondi, Langda, Urdu, Andha, right? We'll say this. And we'll abuse each other with these terms. Shavida, right? Are you deaf? Can't hear. So the terms of disability, idiot, whatever, terms of disability, intellectual disability, physical disability, are terms of abuse. As we know, terms, caste names are also terms of abuse, right? So we need to think about how we use these various terms. In the UK, which model we followed for a very long time, because of colonialism, in the UK, the terms used in the census records, when I was looking at the old census records, the terms used for disability were simply deaf, dumb, blind, lunatic, imbecile, idiot, asylum, inmate, and patient. Right? This, obviously, this kind of, and the words I was using from Tamil and Hindi, they show this how we constructed exclusion. We labeled, we marginalized people for centuries, persons with disabilities. The term changes starts changing only in the second half of the 20th century. And many, and the terms still go around, many of them we still don't accept. And we see this, we see this, how we struggle to change the way we use language. We see this in the way, in our study of women's writing, in our study of how women are represented. We've seen this the way we talk about Dalits. We see, and similar things we see in terms of persons with disability. The move from calling people blind, lame, to simply saying disabled was in itself an enabling move, I would say. More acceptable to me. In UK, they were called disabled, therefore in India as well disabled. In the US, handicapped. And by the way, it's a client of disability, right? And but I'll talk a bit more about this later on. So in the 1980s, in the US, they brought in the term differently able, which many people in India still use. But in the people who engage with disability, this term has fallen out of use. Differently able seemed to be a term that is a term that applies to all of us. I'm differently abled, you are differently abled, all of us are differently able from each other. Just as I wear glasses, I would be unable to really see clearly without my glasses. I'm unable. So I'm starting off with a client of disability right now, right? So all of us are different from each other in terms of our disability in various sectors. So we are also differently able. Sorry, I think I'm overshooting. We are also differently abled from each other because you can see better than me, I can hear better than you, somebody can run faster than somebody else. We have physical attributes, we're all different from our own siblings, our own parents in the same family, we're differently able from each other. Intellectually as well, we're differently able from each other. You know that somebody does maths very well, somebody just cannot understand basic arithmetic. So we are differently intellectually different from each other, differently able from each other. But that is not how differently able was used. Differently able was used to just talk about persons with disability, which seemed then to say that we are able, you are differently able. It's not so different from saying you're disabled. But differently able also in people's minds created an equal playing field. See, We recognize your other abilities. You're differently able. So you should also play to your strengths. We are giving you the space. So don't complain or don't, make the disability of even a part of your identity. Get over it. Get over it. So in a sense, the society gives up its responsibility to create accessible spaces, to create access, to create equality by simply a name change. We saw this with Gandhi and Dalits, Harijan, and you say Harijan with the coining of a name, but as I said in a poem a long time ago, they're untouched even by that change. So nothing happens except that you suddenly say, I equalize the field. You haven't. The material field is still very different. So this is happening, let's say, even now with the government a few years ago wanting to say Divyang for the disabled. Divyang, divine limbs, divine limbed. And this comes to, sorry, can I do, Vijay, do I have 8 or 10 more minutes, or should I quickly get
No, you do have 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay. So with Divyang, as you realize, again, now we call everything sectors. The disability sector protested and pushed back because it seemed to say because you're divinely gifted in a sense as Divyang. So therefore, you get away from the language of rights, language of interaction with people, simply saying you're children of God. So go ahead with your lives. Why should the state intervene, do anything at all for you? Right? There is no need, because I don't need to look at how society creates, reinforces disability, denies access to persons with disability, which is why India was one of the earliest to sign the UN Convention for disability. So persons with disability was what the term used, and the term that people still use and want to use, continue to use, right? Because there is no need for euphemism. What there is need is for engagement. So when you're translating, very quickly to bring this to the idea of translation, let me say that get to 2 theories. One is someone who is a preacher. This is Kerry Wynn, talking about translating the Bible and for translating it for persons with disability. So his thing is very interesting. He says almost all the old texts use very negative language about disabled people, use this as metaphoric, disability is metaphoric, and the Bible should be inclusive. So in this, therefore he thinks for an inclusive Bible translation, and you should know, of course, the community that you're addressing, and you have 4 principles, he says. You should use people first terminology, which is that you don't say blind person. Blind is just part of the identity. Person is bigger than that. He's got other things. She or he, they have other things, right? They are made up of so many different factors. So you put the people first. The language acknowledged as appropriate by those who have the disability. Use such language that is appropriate and approved. So this can change with time. This can also change with culture. This can change with the country, the language that you're using. Don't use euphemistic language, because they don't want, nobody wants euphemistic language, because that seems to then take away the attention completely, take away the engagement completely, disability, and avoid clinical terminology. So these are straightforward things. Don't medicalize it. Don't gloss over it. Don't use language that people who are disabled do not like. And please look at them as human beings who have a disability, just like all of us really have. I mean, it's my point, but who have a certain disability, and it's just part of who they are. And this seems to be that this is where differently abled and all and Divyang go out of the window. I would think here. And to go on, there is this whole thing of, when you're talking about translation theory and disability, there is an Israeli Mizrachi, Israeli scholar Mizrachi, who talks about how when they wanted rights to be based, disability rights to be part of everyday understanding and struggle and acceptance in terms of state and citizens, and they wanted to be carried through to everyone, to all citizens of Israel. They needed to go through religious leaders in terms of Islam. And this is an interesting thing if you think about it in terms of most religions and our understanding of reincarnation, our understanding of God in most religions, is that if you're born, something happens to you, you're suffering for some sin, or God is testing you. God is testing you. You did something, you've done something, and you have to pass the test. So in our religions always explain disabilities in terms of, you're being tested. And very often in terms of sin, that you sinned in your past life. They realized that the Muslim clergy was doing what Mr. otherwise is called modular translation. When you one module of translation it's changed, the language is changed, it's completely. So he noticed that the translation was being done in religious terms, instead of secular terms, instead of liberal base of human rights. It was completely religious. It became the religious duty of everyone to ensure the well-being and access for all persons with disability. So this you can see in, as one of the activists told me and administrators told me, in Punjab, for example, when they went to Gurdwaras to talk about persons with disability and their rights and action. So they were told, there's no issue here, there's no issue. They're all, sent by God to enjoy life, to do whatever they want. Why should we force them into activity which is useful, productive? They can do what they want. We are here, we're taking care of them. We make, it's not like they are not part of our society, they're central to our society. So don't worry, we don't need your newfangled ideas. So, there are ways in which religion can be considerate, can be made considerate, can be considerate itself to persons with disability. And that's a way of coping for families as well. So I will not discard religious approaches, except to say that the wishes, the aspirations of persons with disability should be also given space to in this religious read. I'll quickly read a poem that I wrote, so to see where I'm coming from. This is a poem I wrote on a multiply handicapped nephew who died at 21, but he had not been given more than 2 years to live. This is called Ishwar Natarajan. Appa said the other day that Ishu, you are a saint reborn to live out your unspent days, your parents, the blessed ones. A soul so noble, he said, beyond thought and action, inspiring in your parents a selfless dedication to all special children. Ishu, you, Appa said, are a saint reborn, but the doctors only know the brain that can't and the unworldly body that will grow. So this is a mechanism for coping, for being, being at peace with what's happening around, in terms of family things. But it doesn't mean that access should not be made available. It does not mean that any technology should not be developed. It does not mean the rights should not be rights should not be respected. And of course, people versus disability should not be invisibilized, but must be seen all the time. So in effect, therefore, that you must, as a translator, you must know, of course, your audience, you must translate from the audience, but as an activist, you have to translate texts that you want to translate in order to convey certain things. And I have noticed this, that when one translates the text of the marginalized, of the oppressed, one is always already an activist. You actually want to say, what the hell, right? And we need to be part of the struggle. We need to be part, an ally. Whether they recognized us as allies or not, we must play the role, at least for our own conscience. And most people who study disability studies, scholars, most people translators in disability studies now, after that I know now, most of them see theirs as an activist role. And I said, when we do this, when you're translating for a religious audience, don't discount religion, because let's say Hindus, you can see in among Hindu gods iconography, people with completely different features, right? People with completely different kinds of limbs. So it's something that a visualization would actually, help people to be able to engage with and understand disability, people with disability. When you're translating the English, the other way around, when you're translating Indian languages, there are resources that you can use. When you translate into English, things get secularized. Even when you are translating Indian Christian texts, because Indian Christian texts are very different from the Christianity that imbues English generally, right? So it can both ways. When you translate into Indian languages, when you translate into English, there are things you lose, there are things you gain, right? So it may be easy for you to remove it from the religious matrix of retribution, language of sin, when you translate in English, and to make people look at disability through the completely different eyes. So language should not come in the way of expression. So I'm putting my paper away because now I'm really running out of time. I'm sorry, I had a lot more to say. I'm not even started on the, but I hope I said enough for you to make the correlations. Because one of the things that I see in myself, and this is ending with a very personal note, that as a scholar, within quotation marks, because I don't think of myself much of a scholar or translation studies, but as someone who's begun to practice in a more serious manner, and translating Dalit text, translating disability text, trying to make resources available for disability studies. That's one of the aims that we have. I realized that in terms of caste, in terms for the Dalit, in terms of the ableist language that very often I find myself using, and as an ableist translator, what it does, translation does, which it always does, is to make you interrogate every word that you speak, every word that you write. Right? It makes you think about how to do this jugalbandi, how to show in a language which you feel very comfortable in, the resistance that is in the other language, the play that the other language is showing, because these are people who are fighting the oppression in their text. And how do I carry this out? And how do I, in text by non-disabled people, written by non-disabled people, in that text, how do I, in my translation, highlight the disability, highlight what's happening, highlight the resistance and the impact on the lives of disabled of society around them? How do I do this? How do I do this? Right? So, which is where I want to stop, say, this is the activity all of us should be part of, all of us should participate in, to create the space that we want to live in. We want to live in an Akhand Bharat, which is actually an inclusive India, not in terms of boundaries, not in terms of landmass, but in terms of even ourselves, even in the limited space that we have, to be completely inclusive on a university campus, in a city, in a state. We got to start somewhere, and I hope all of you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasad. Is absolutely on time, to the T. Thank you very much. And this allows us about 15 minutes or so for discussion. And friends, as you have heard, Professor Prasad, he has raised several questions, but also very kindly provided, if not answers, directions towards finding the answers. And both translation as a conversation, and then he very, very skillfully navigated the connection between translation and disability, translation and ability. And I'll just mention one important aspect which he raised, which is disability blind readers as opposed to disabled conscious or disabled sensitive writers, which I thought was a very interesting point. And in a way that also connects to, why is it that we became disabled? He also provided an answer in terms of the accommodative culture, if I may say that, that we have, which does not allow us to see disability as something unusual. This again connects with what we all know, that we really have no theory of translation in India because we never thought of the translation as something that needs to be theorized. So I think that's again a kind of a connection between what Professor Prasad said about why is it that we don't recognize disability, because we treated it as normal, treated it as part of our life. And that's why we never actually became conscious of it, just as we did not become conscious of translation till we are, in a way, forced to look at translation and what it could do. Thank you very much, Professor Prasad. And now I invite questions, comments, quarrels. So all welcome. And please keep your questions short so that Professor Prasad will have time to answer them. I see Professor Lakshmi Haribandi raising her hand. Please go ahead, Lakshmi Garu.
Professor Prasad Garu, your presentation was excellent. It made us think of many things related to translation, and this very word itself, disability, it can be extended to many things. Disability of people like Dalit writers who write in their native dialect, to even people like Muthupalani. In a way, she was also her disability because she was a Devadasi, how her text was treated, not for the merit of the text, but who she was, etc. In that context, sir, I was thinking of something like, if we have to, as translation, as you rightly said, it is an enabling act. When we enable these Dalit writers, marginalized writers, to help them enable their voice to be heard, to far and wide, we have to resort to translation, of course, and that is English. When we are translating these texts, like on the one hand, like people like Spivak say that, okay, we cannot expect them to translate, to write in English, or we cannot translate. When you translate, everything looks alike, and that kind of homogenization happens. So the particular language, the personalized idiom cannot be translated into English. So how do we do justice to this kind of a writing when we are enabling? Like, do we have any suggestion as to how one should handle such texts when one is translating into English, sir?
Can I answer the question first, or are we taking all the questions?
No. Go ahead.
Right, because this has been part of the paper actually. So this is part of what I wanted to talk about if I had the time. This is, as Vijay knows, this is something I've been saying for decades, that how Indian English is a language for translation. All right. So I don't think of Indian English as one language. I think it as a creative effort that each of us creates our own Indian English, and we keep changing it. It keeps changing all the time. And if we understand how we can use it as Indian English creatively, as our writers do, because in English you have to create a particular small town in a particular, in perhaps a monolingual area, which is not English. So how do you do this? And how do you show the multiplicity of languages in one language, English? So both ways Indian English writers do it. So which is what I've always advocated Indian English translators should also do, right? To keep change the English according to context, of course, and to Indianize it in particular ways, in specific ways, in things you want to do. I've talked about how to translate Mama, what one must do, and I can tell you what one must not do. What one must not do is to sanitize her language, because it's part of the performance, what she's doing, right? Part of a language performance creates a text that she uses certain words, that she uses certain structures, that she misspells words, and as you horrified, how can she misspell words in Tamil? But it's deliberately done to also represent how people speak in that particular area, in that particular community. So all kinds of, in any literary text, so many things happening at a given point of time. And to deny that the Dalit writer will not be doing it except by in error, or that somebody disabled obviously dictated and something else was done, whatever. If you have, to bring in other kinds of factors into play, and to sanitize, to standardize, to homogenize, is to kill the text. Why are you even translating? You're translating because of its uniqueness, because of what it's saying, and what it's saying is part of the language that is being used and used in specific ways. That's why I said there are resistances in the text, which you have to replay in English, Somebody, I will not go into one of my future projects, which if it comes through, is to simply do a translation once again in English of a text, because the writer felt that that text had been, in the English text, did not do justice to what she had done. Because she said, I think the translator was too coy, could not sort, a lot of my text was vulgar and would not translate it. All right. And she says, I want somebody who will actually say, I'll do what you have done. That's what I want. So will you look at it? So it may be a project that I'll do in the future, because we're still talking about what is wrong with the previous text and why do you want a new translation within a decade of the old one. All right. But you can see even the writers are aware. Even the writers are saying, this is not what I did. When I look at the English and it's not what I did. So I don't want this translation at all. So this is something we must do. We must, as I said, we must be aware. We must replay what has been done, reperform. I call it a jugalbandi when I talk to my students. I would not use it when I'm talking here, because it still needs to be thought of in terms of theorization. But I talk of a translation as jugalbandi because here is a text in one language and you're replaying it in another language. Of course, you're riffing because there are things you cannot do and things you can do which are not done there. But it should be visibly a play with that, right? Somebody who knows the two languages will say, "Oh yes, you're taking, not say, oh my God, you missed so much of what is there because you don't think this language, people reading this language should read such stuff. They will misunderstand." No. So if we can actually bring this translational intent, that's why I said all translators are activists in some sense. If we bring this intent to the translating this text, we can fall, we can try and fail, but that doesn't mean we should not try at all. Right? The other way, homogenizing, standardizing, sanitizing, is the worst way possible, rather than not translate.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for asking the question. Really.
Yeah.
May I speak?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure,
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Yeah, nice to, first of all, thanks for that fantastic lecture, Professor Prasad, and nice seeing you, and also Vijay here. Yeah, I'm Shivaram Padikal speaking.
I know, sir.
Yeah, and I raised my hand, and then I'm not very sure how to actually formulate it, formulate my question, because, well, lecture on the one hand it was very, what do you say, it was very easy to understand, very lucid. At the same time, I understand that it was very dense and layered. Okay. So I would like to, like to try to address that density and layers of your lecture. And I am not very sure how to do it, but however, I will ask my question, however silly it is. Okay, one thing which I was struck with is your, this, I have read your this fantastic volume you have edited on disability and translation. And I also taught it in my class, not only about disability, but in a way we are all disabled today. Okay, as in the beginning of your lecture, you in a passing reference you have mentioned, and how to translate that disability is a question. Then the other thing is, while talking about translating India, you have used the term discovering India. We know that all the problems that we are facing today politically, okay, is due to the understanding and translation of India on the basis of the Orientalist and colonialist historians. The very basis of the present dispensation is a Western history, notwithstanding its claims for Vishwaguru-ness of India or whatever. Okay, so in this context, I have two questions. One is about several scholars who have analyzed the present situation have actually were saying that, or arguing that it's a kind of popular backlash because the Nehruvian ideology and the Nehruvian, India, or the notion of India and its policies were elitist. Okay, and this is popular. This is a populist backlash. That is one. And the other question is, in your lecture, why you have also invoked the same discovery, which notion of discovery, which comes from the notion of teleological history. So I know you know this and you have deliberately used it, maybe to remind us about Nehru or for some other reason. But I just want you to tell us about it. That's another thing. And third thing is, interestingly, in the present present translation of Indian ethos, I have been along with the ideology of whatever today's our rulers are, that is BJP and RSS or Sangha Parivar. I have been with them for years, okay, till my MA days, and then I departed. Okay, so that's a long story. But we never used India in those days. Okay, but now the present Indian government and the leader, prime minister, etc., are using the term, okay, the new India, and they are using the term India. India was not acceptable. It was, as you said, Bharat was acceptable. Neither Hindustan, of course, the Urdu speakers were using it, maybe Hindi speakers, but Hindustan was not acceptable. But they were using Bharat, and now we are using, so with the modernity, with the post-modernity, the notion of India, or even the word of India, okay, it's a transliteration as well as a translation. Okay, is getting more and more this thing, and I'm just curious to know, your responses to that. Okay, I'm not very sure whether I have put it my question very rightly or not. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway.
Thank you very much. Those are lovely questions, actually speaking. And part of it, yeah, as Vijay pointed out, that discovering India was simply Nehruvian echo that I was using. And one of the things that I was hoping that would resonate was that the Nehruvian India was an inclusive India, completely inclusive India, which in terms of discovering India itself. And I thought that I was going to be talking about inclusiveness. I was even going to call it rediscovering India. But then I said no, because it's a continuous process. You discover all the time. It's not like something existed, you're rediscovering it, but you're discovering all the time. So I want to go with discovering. So that I hope answers that question. The thing about history, one of the things that I didn't read out is about exactly what you're saying. That we have gone, even in the Constituent Assembly, when we look at debates and we go pre-Islamic, etc., the whole idea, and there are lots of people who say very Hindutva things in the Constituent Assembly, by the way.
Yeah.
Which you read now and you say, wow, it's being said then in the Constituent Assembly. And they actually are going with the British. See, let's be clear. Britishers wrote our history just like they mapped us. They mapped our text, they mapped our laws, because they need to govern in a certain way. They need to govern us. They need to create an understanding about themselves of us. But we bought that understanding. We invested in their understanding of us. So it's an interesting two-way thing that happened, that as they wrote about us and as they translated us, they actually ended up translating us. We got translated. And we got translated. And we accept the way they look at India. That's why you can see in this present dispensation, a complete logical outcome of that. To go back, to discover the glory that was India, right? So you go back and say, yeah, Bashemite, we were such a great civilization till Islam came, etc., etc. And to go back there, because that is us truly, that is our spirit. As Kamalapati Tripathi says, the Constituent Assembly, we lost our spirit when the Muslims came. We have to rediscover our spirit, the real spirit of India. So the same terminology, same language, same thing is being used now. Going back to, but with coming of it, and that's a very interesting take that you have, and I think I agree with you, with coming of globalization, while you accept all that, but you're also accepting your place in the international table, you're taking your space there. And if others see you as India, yes, I'm a modern nation. I'm a modern technological nation. I am the powerhouse of this world. I'm going to be the powerhouse of this world. So, and remember also, it is in the last 20 odd years now, it's never, because we're never very good at setting policy agenda and working for it as a nation. But the idea is that India will be an English-speaking nation for this reason, that even soft skills, the idea of soft skills, the idea of teaching English to the workers of the nation. Why? Because, by the way, I actually saw a government contract with a particular country, which said that we supply you with so many plumbers. So it's interesting. The plumbers should know the English spoken in that country, that accent, the vocabulary there, and should be conversant with the complete modern technology that's available there. So the plumbers being trained in new technology as also in that particular brand of English. It was a very interesting exercise that was happening. And I was told there were more and more such contracts in the pipeline. Yeah. So we were going to be this. On the one hand, technological leaders. On the other hand, the working class of the world, the workers of the world. And so, and how are we going to be that? We are going to be that by showing ourselves as this new India, not which has the essence of old Bharat. We come from there, we come from all that, but we are new India. Even as we hark back to the past, we are still working towards our place now and our place of future. I would read it like that, the way you were reading it, actually. You put that thought in my head. And so I would say that's how I'd read this business of why. I really thought about it. Yes, you're right. There's more often than not, I only hear India now. I don't hear Bharat at all. And that's interesting. Thank you for the question and thank you for making me think.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Prasad. Because this question basically came because as you know, you, Vijay, and others, you know, I am fighting a sort of a battle with my own family members, youngsters. Okay, and where you know they trust only the translation. They don't want even to see the sources. Don't want to see the source text. Don't want to see the original. Okay. So they trust that one particular kind of translation, one version, and they don't want to trust. Even if I encourage them to see the original and the original sources, they refuse to do that. It is in that you know, I think it's a common experience for you know, someone of our age, and it is from that context I have asked this question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shivram. Yeah, I think we can take one last question, and this is from Ajay Verma.
Hello, sir. This is not the question, but rather a small clarification.
Okay.
You were earlier referring to that it is not Manuvad that unites the country, but it is Anuvad. I am asking you whether you are quoting someone or whether you are quoting yourself. I mean, I want this clarification. I mean, this uses, particular uses. Yeah.
I was just quoting myself. I was being cute.
Yeah, because I also come across this uses by Rita Kotari earlier in 2005 or somewhere. She tells that our journey should be from Manuvad to Anuvad. So I was wondering whether you were quoting her or yourself.
No, Rita and I have been in conversation for decades again.
Yeah.
So it could have come from anywhere, but I've used this.
Yeah, that's what, just a clarification. Thank you, sir.
Do we have any other question or a comment? We have about 2 minutes to go. We are already, we have
1:08. We have short
8 minutes beyond. I think we are kind of intruded into your lunch.
Yes.
Other
people's lunches.
Yes. So I think we should wrap it up before people start cursing us. Thank you very much, Prasad, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you, and particularly to listen to you about translation and you know, and your recent entry into the disability studies and how you are tying it up with the translation. I see that Pragya has a question. Yes, can you make it very quick?
Two more in the chat box too, in the YouTube.
Oh. I don't have access to the YouTube chat box, but yeah, Pragya Singh. Pragya Singh, do you have a question?
Can I say something?
Yes. Yeah, if Ivy, yes, go ahead.
Hello, GJV sir. It's wonderful to see you again. Yes. Sir, I wanted to say something about the way you have spoken about. Okay, let me switch on my video. I wanted to say that the way you have given, idealized the whole issue about how we must all see everyone as having some disabilities, and everyone, having some problems, common problems, and that we should all be, kind to each other. So this, I think, sort of diffuses the reality of this, the kind of life that we are living actually. Because I think to say that everyone has problems, I think it does not actually keep I mean, there are some groups that have more problems than others, of course. And of course, within those groups also there are some.
I'm sorry, that was a message you got from my saying that. My saying that was very simple. Because we are so good at othering. We other all the time. And in terms of disability, you can be, you can shock the ableist language use. You can shock people who are ableist by saying, I'm sorry, you're disabled too, but you don't recognize it. And there are people with very real handicaps, which And many of those handicaps can be cannot be rectified, but can be managed through some of the handicap can be removed. Some of it can be removed by simply social, legal access, right? And you can understand that if you realize yourself that it is not that they are somewhere else, there's others who have to work for themselves, but as a whole, people with all of us with different disabilities, but us having asymmetrical, better access, far better access, we have to work towards a society that's completely inclusive, that actually addresses and engages with physical, intellectual disability and the constraints that social construction of this places on people with disabilities. You know, this is what I was saying. I was moving the language away from medical to simply to social. So I had to say this in order for people to rethink, and you know, and ultimately, though this is not the aim, but when you're asking me, I would say that it's a way of looking at people. All of us are saying we're all self-centered. We are all self-centered and selfish. Unless we are told that this has an impact on you, that disability, and that ability is very contingent. Ability is temporary. That today you may be able in things ways, you think I'm very, and the word they use most is normal. I'm normal every which way. Today you may be in an accident. Today you may be, in a couple of hours, you may be what you have always thought of as other disabled people, you may be there. So this is what the understanding that I want to raise, right? I want to do that. That is why I said this. That I didn't, if I read my paper out properly, the next sentence would have been also the contingent temporary nature of ability, right? Which is what I want to get to too. But
Yeah.
as I said, good question to ask. And also about tribal, I know your work, and I know even in the very next panel is going to talk. So I said, oh, I don't need to go there.
Yeah.
Actually, I was asking about something else too. I wanted to talk about animal behavior. I've been watching these videos where scientists, the people who have worked on animal behavior, I have watched these videos about Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey, who worked on chimpanzee and the mountain gorilla. And these are primates which have only 1% difference from humans. Okay, so they are considered to be very good studies for human behavior. So the fact is that in the animal species also you have all these conflicts between different species over resources and over space. So this is also something which I think reflects the kind of conflicts that we have in the world today.
Yeah.
So there are all these conflicts that are going on right for space and for resources. This is happening in India itself and also in the West, in different parts of the world. So therefore, I think animal behavior, I think, can be a very good indicator of what is happening in the human world. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I just read one or two comments in the chat box. Usha Mudiganti was asking, I wonder who understands the announcement in Hindi in the Delhi metro stations requesting reserving the tactile path for the visually challenged users of the station. So, I mean, who is it meant for? You know, it's very interesting.
I'm always bewildered.
Yeah. And I think that reminds me of what years and years ago, Balraj Sahani, who was working for BBC World Hindi service, you know, he once said that it's not news in Hindi, but you know, it's Hindi in the news. You know, so what we are trying to convey is not clear. Chandrasekhar Rao is asking how to ensure translation and transliteration authenticity to the original work. I think this needs an entire session altogether. I think the last word, of course, belongs to Tarkeshwar. And so, Tarkeshwar, please go ahead and ask your question at the risk of delaying the lunch. Go ahead.
Sorry for that coming at the end. It was wonderful, GJV, listening to you, and the way you put it, how translation enables us to see certain things which we did not see earlier. So this entire project that you and Sati Someshwar had undertaken made us look at certain things which we did not look at earlier as disability literature. So was it discovering or reconstituting? Was it there and we discovered it, or it was there in a different form and the translation reconstituted it to in a different way altogether? So whether the translation is a tool of discovery or is it a tool which can alter the way we look at things? That's the question I think that came up in your talk.
I think it's both, isn't it? I mean, it's both, because as a translator, you have to discover it and you have to reconstitute it in a way that everybody else also sees it. Right? So it's like there are two sides of the same coin. I mean, I don't think how you can reconstitute something in a particular way if you've not seen it already, if you've not discovered it there. And this is a discovery for most of us because we didn't see those texts in that manner earlier. There are stories after stories that we discussed in the workshop that people had known forever, but never seen those in terms of disability. Tagore's text, some of the text by the Urdu writers, the new writers. Nobody had seen those texts in this manner. So, anyways, the progressive writers. So it's good that we did that. So good that these books are coming out. But in any case, as I said, our job as translators, as interested people invested in the future of this country that we're born in, that we're citizens of, is continue to resist other translations by our own translations. Continue to give our translation. This is Professor Padikal asked us, part of this is to, why are people buying into that translation? Because we are not being loud and out there with our translations. And disability, Dalit, feminist is part of it. But overall, we had to create our India. And our India has to be created by us in our translation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Prasad. And thank you, Tarkeshwar. And with that, friends, we close this session. And I suppose it's time for lunch. Thank you very much, Tarkeshwar, for asking me to chair this session. And lovely to be with you, once again, Prasad. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you everyone for making this session a particularly engaging one. We will now break for lunch and will reconvene at 2 p.m. for session 8. Thank you.